So good afternoon and welcome to today's event. So it's a great pleasure to have Ashok today to speak about the science of Indian cooking, and this, especially on this context of the book that he has written, Masala Lab, the Science of Indian. This event is part of the public lectures that the Institute organizes, and we are very glad to collaborate with Tamil Nadu Science Forum for this event. So food is of course central to our life, and there has been knowledge about food preparation for ages, and it has transferred orally from generation to generation, and now of course it's being curated online. There are millions of videos which of course all of us spend time on. But then we would like to really understand that how things are prepared, why some techniques work, why some techniques don't work, why some ingredients mix together and others don't. And so this is the science of cooking and science of food. And this is very much relevant both at the level of home cooking and also at the industrial preparation and so on. And so just to connect to science that we do here at the Institute, so this Institute has disciplines in physics, maths, computer science, and computational biology. So for example, in physics, there is this division called condensed matter or soft matter, and some of us work on this field in soft matter, and the food is a soft material, and the flow of food, the rheology of food, these are of course of broad interest to many of us. A brief word about the speaker. So Ashok professionally, or his training is as an engineer. So he works at the Tata Consultancy Services next door in the Ramanujam IT Park, where he's the global head of the digital workspace. He's also an avid musician. Actually, the previous event for which he had come here was for a music event. This was some years back. And we are very glad to have him here now, talking about food, about which he's also passionate and which many of us are also passionate about. So before I hand over to him, I just request Tamil Nadu Science Forum to say a few words.
தமிழ்நாடு அறிவியல் இயக்கத்தின் சார்பாக உங்கள் அனைவரையும் வரவேற்பதில் பெரும் மகிழ்ச்சி கொள்கிறேன். தமிழ்நாடு அறிவியல் இயக்கமானது அறிவியல் பரப்புரை என்ற குழுவாக ஒரு குழு, அதில் இறங்கும் ஒரு குழுவானது தொடர்ச்சியாக இது போன்ற அறிவியல் உரைகளை நாங்கள் நடத்தி கொண்டு வருகிறோம். இது எங்களுடைய 59வது அறிவியல் உரை. இந்த உரையை நாங்கள் IMSc நிறுவனத்துடன் இணைந்து நடத்துவதில் பெருமை கொள்கிறோம். தமிழ்நாடு அறிவியல் இயக்கம் என்ற அமைப்பானது 1980ஆம் ஆண்டில் துவங்கப்பட்ட ஒரு அமைப்பாகும். இந்த அமைப்பு சில ஆய்வாளர்களால் சென்னை பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் பயின்று கொண்டிருந்த சில ஆய்வாளர்களால் துவக்கப்பட்ட அமைப்பு. அன்றைய தினத்தில் இது போன்ற அரங்க கூட்டங்கள், அறிவியல் அரங்க கூட்டங்கள் நடத்தி கொண்டிருந்த அமைப்பாக இருந்தது. ஒரு கட்டத்தில் அரங்கத்தை விட்டு வெளியேறி அறிவொளி இயக்கம் என்ற இயக்கத்தில் இணைந்து தமிழகம் முழுதும் அறிவொளி ஃபங்க்ஷனல் லிட்ரஸிக்காக நாங்கள் பணியாற்றினோம். அப்பொழுதுதான் இந்த அமைப்பை விரிவடைந்து தமிழகத்தின் எல்லா பகுதிகளுக்கும் சென்றது. இன்றைக்கு தமிழ்நாட்டில் எல்லா மாவட்டங்கள்லையும் இந்த அமைப்பு இயங்கிக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது. ஒவ்வொரு மாவட்டத்துக்கும் அதற்கே உரித்தான நிர்வாக குழு இயங்கிக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது. மாநில அளவிலே ஒரு குழு இயங்கிக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது. மாநில அளவிலே எங்களுடைய பணிகளை 6 பிரிவுகளாக பிரித்து செயல்பட்டு கொண்டிருக்கிறோம். ஒன்று அறிவியல் பரப்புரை, இதுதான் முதல்ல நாங்கள் துவங்கியது. அடுத்தது பெண்களை அறிவியலில் கொண்டு வர வேண்டும் என்பதற்காக சமம் என்ற அமைப்பு, அதுவும் அறிவியல் இயக்கத்தின் ஒரு அங்கமாக இருக்கிறது. மூன்றாவதாக யூத் ஃபார் சயின்ஸ், இளைஞர்கள் அறிவியலை கொண்டு வருவதற்காக ஒரு அமைப்பாக நடத்துகிறோம். அடுத்தது சயின்ஸ் பப்ளிகேஷன், அறிவியல் வெளியீடுகளை நாங்கள் வெளியிட்டுக் கொண்டிருக்கிறோம். அத்துடன் 2 மேகசின்ஸ், துளிர், ஜந்தர் மந்தர், துளிர் என்ற இதழ் தமிழிலும், ஜந்தர் மந்தர் இதழ் என்ற இதழ் ஆங்கிலத்திலும் வருகிறது. இந்த 2 இதழ்களும் எந்த அட்வர்டைஸ்மெண்ட்டும் இல்லாமல் நடந்துகிட்டு இருக்கு. கடந்த 30 ஆண்டுகளாக நடந்துகிட்டு இருக்கு. எல்லா துளிர் குழந்தைகளுக்கான அறிவியல் இதழ், அது துளிர் படிக்கும் குழந்தைகள் எல்லாம் இணைந்து துளிர் இல்லம் என்ற அமைப்பை நடத்தி அதை வாசித்து அதன் மூலமாக அறிவியலை கற்றுக்கொள்ளக்கூடிய ஒரு இயக்கமும் எங்களுக்குள் நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கிறது. ஆறாவது அமைப்பாக நாங்கள் இப்போது நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கக்கூடிய சுற்றுச்சூழல் பிரச்சனைகள், வளர்ச்சி, சுற்றுச்சூழல், இவை இரண்டிற்கும் எந்த அடிப்படையில் ஒரு ட்ரேட் ஆஃப் காம்ப்ரமைஸ் பண்றது, வளர்ச்சியும் தேவை, அதே நேரத்தில் நாம் சுற்றுச்சூழலும் தேவை, இது ரெண்டுக்கும் நடுவில் எந்த பொசிஷன் எடுக்கிறது, இதுல பல்வேறு குழுக்கள் பல்வேறு கருத்துக்கள் வருது. அதை நாங்கள் ஆய்வு செய்து இதில் ஒவ்வொரு பிரச்சனைகளையும் அறிவியல் பூர்வமான ஒரு நிலைப்பாடை எடுப்பதற்கு இந்த குழு இயங்கிக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது. ஆக 6 தளங்களிலே எங்கள் அறிவியல் இயக்கம் பணியாற்றி கொண்டிருக்கிறது. நாங்கள் இருக்கக்கூடிய இந்த PSL பாப்புலர் சயின்ஸ் லெக்சர் என்ற ஒரு சிறு குழுவானது தமிழக அளவிலே இயங்கக்கூடிய அறிவியல் பரப்புரை என்ற குழுவின் கீழ் இயங்கக்கூடிய ஒரு குழுவாகும். இது தொடர்ச்சியாக நாங்கள் அறிவியல் பிரச்சாரங்களையும் கூட்டங்களையும் நடத்தி வருகிறோம். இதுவரை 58 நடத்தி 59வது லெக்சர் வந்திருக்கிறது. இந்த 58 லெக்சர்ல 5 ஆண்டுகளிலே ஒவ்வொரு நோபல் பரிசு அறிவிக்கப்பட்ட பிறகு அந்த 3 நோபல் பரிசுகளுக்கான லெக்சர், அதுவே 15 லெக்சர் நடந்திருக்கு. கொரோனா வந்த பொழுது இந்த கோவிட்-19 பத்தி ஒரு 7-8 சீரீஸ், அதுல கோவிட் வைரஸ்ல ஆய்வு செய்த டாக்டர் பவித்ரா அவங்களை கொண்டு லெக்சர் நடத்தியிருக்கிறோம். இது போல தொடர்ச்சியாக எங்கள் பணிகள் தொடரும். இந்த நிகழ்ச்சி கிறிஸ் வந்திருக்கிறார், எங்களுக்கு ரொம்ப மகிழ்ச்சியாக இருக்கிறது. அவருடைய புத்தகம் ரொம்ப பாப்புலரான புத்தகம். அதோட அவருடைய உரையாடும் பொழுது ரொம்ப இன்ட்ரெஸ்டா இருந்துச்சு. அவர் சொன்ன விஷயங்கள் எல்லாமே கனெக்ட் பண்ணி பார்க்க வேண்டியிருந்து. இந்த உரையை நீங்கள் நிச்சயமாக என்ஜாய் பண்ணி கேட்பீங்கன்னு நான் நம்புகிறேன். கிறிஸ் அழைத்து.
Okay, am I audible? Does the mic need to be closer? All right, super. Okay, so this is going to be not one of your usual kinds of talks, and at some point of time I hope I can do this entire thing in Tamil as well, if for a subsequent audience. So that's also fine, right? So rather than just get into a bunch of slides about what is the science of Indian cooking, how does pressure cooking work, how do spices work, that's the usual part. You can read my book for it, right? So I don't have to. This is not a presentation about my book. So I want to start off by waking all of you up and saying that I want to tell you the story of one dish, and then in telling the story of that one dish, I want to cover the evolutionary biology, the biochemistry, physics, neurogastronomy, cognitive neuroscience, and metabolism, a range of subjects just to describe one dish, right? And there's a reason I picked this dish. If you are vegetarian, it's okay, but there's a reason I picked this particular dish, because it had to tell the full story, right? So the dish is chicken curry. It's okay, if you're vegetarian, you can assume it's paneer, it doesn't matter, but there's a reason why I picked chicken curry, and I will explain why. So the first half an hour will be the story of chicken curry, one dish. Normally, if people will tell you, oh, you heat oil in a pan, put curry leaves, put cumin, put mustard, and then you put the chicken, put the turmeric, and put salt, and put tamarind, and then you make something. I think that's the recipe. Okay? But this is the 2.7 billion year story, science story of chicken curry. Okay, so I'm going to start with that. Right? Quick introduction to myself. I work at TCS full time, but obviously I think we all need to cook and eat. So therefore cooking, I don't see it as a hobby. People say, tell me whether cooking is a hobby. No, I say cooking is a life skill. Right? Much like breathing is a life skill and heart beating is a life skill, cooking is a life skill. I think if there is one skill that all of you can have that is nearly guaranteed and strongly correlated with having a long, healthy life, it's the ability to cook your own food. If you're only going to do Swiggy, Zomato, you'll have on an average, I think maybe 5-10 years less of life expectancy, if you will. Okay. So, but outside of music, outside of work, I do music. There's an album of Sanskrit rock, which you can listen to on iTunes and so on. And there's also I've written Masala. So back to chicken curry. I'm going to start the story 2.7 billion years ago. Trust me, this is still only a half an hour story of chicken curry. Okay. 2.7 billion years ago, all the life that existed on the planet was single cell life called prokaryotic life. Okay. Let me explain. So these are very basic, not modern cells. These are not even like your modern day bacteria. Right? These are very, very ancient in the sense that these are the most archaic forms of life. Okay? 2.7 billion years ago, the only way these cells evolved is that apparently we still don't know. I think what happens is that a replicating molecule like a DNA or an RNA ended up getting enveloped by a fat membrane, a lipid membrane that is generally considered to be like the origin of life. Right? All of this is murky. We still don't know where it happened, how it happened, but roughly. So it evolved into prokaryotic forms of life. You still see some of them protozoa and so on. But 2.7 billion years ago, it is estimated that one of these cells did something interesting. Normally, what these cells do is that they go find other cells and they evolve mechanisms to kill them. Right? So, when one cell kills and eats another cell, that's the fundamental definition of food. It's true of everything you eat. Other than salt, every single thing you eat is another kind of cell. Could be a plant cell, could be a fungal cell, could be an animal cell, but it's a cell nonetheless, right? Either the killing happens in the slaughterhouse in the case of meat, or the slaughter happens in your pan in the case of vegetables, right? Plants, by the way, are still alive when you cook them. They die only when you actually heat them. When you actually in the pan is when those cells die. Okay? So, long story short, going back to 2.7 billion years ago, cells normally just eat other cells. But one weird thing happened, right? As with most life, these accidents are what propelled evolution forward. One cell ate another cell, and instead of digesting it and eating it and using up all the amino acids and all the other things inside, it decided to keep it alive, right? Think of it as a consensual kidnapping. So this cell kidnapped another cell. Okay? And that cell, they struck a bargain saying that, you know what, the one inside said, I will purely take care of managing your energy, like your accountant, right? I will, like accountant takes care of money. I will manage all your energy needs. Then you deal with other things. You can focus on other things. You don't have to waste most of your energy on trying to digest food and deal with all of that. I will deal with energy, right? You just go give me raw material, I'll figure it out, right? And that was the birth of the mitochondria. Okay. So if you studied your school and they say a cell has a mitochondria, you may not have realized that the mitochondria was actually another single cell life that was kidnapped, likely a bacteria that was kidnapped by another ancient bacteria, and then that essentially became the first eukaryotic cell. All right. Now, why is this important? Because if this kidnapping didn't happen, there would be no chicken curry, there'd be no human beings, there'd be no plants, there'd be no other form of life that we know today. This is the first original thing that resulted in the chicken curry that we ultimately got, right? So as I said, I think the eukaryotic form of life, all of a sudden, these cells became super advanced. They had a massive advantage because now they had an internal machinery that said, you know what, I can focus on energy, you can do other things. And so these cells were able to do a lot more things. For starters, they were able to form multicellular life. Before this, all life was only one cell. These cells now said, you know what, I can focus on collaborating with other cells. I can focus on specialization. I can form the first jellyfishes. I can form other kinds of, underwater oceans. All of this stuff is happening in the ocean, by the way, right? And so this consensual kidnapping, scientists unfortunately use a more boring word called endosymbiosis. Okay, so that's the technical term. I call it consensual kidnapping. Okay. Now, this is 2.7 billion years ago. And now fast forward a lot of time to about 450 million to about 2 billion. We still don't know quite, not really sure when. It's a very long range of time. This kidnapping that I spoke about happened again. So one eukaryotic cell now kidnapped another bacteria, except this time that other bacteria had a special ability. This was a cyanobacteria that did not have to rely on killing and eating another cell, because it had a superpower It had a small little thing called a chloroplast that allowed it to directly convert the sun's energy into glucose. So this was kidnapped by the cell, and that particular cell became the ancestor of every plant that we have today. And the guy before that kidnapping is the ancestor of all life, right? And the ones that did not do the kidnapping became the ancestor of all of us, all animals. And the one that kidnapped once more. So in a sense, plants are technically a slightly more advanced form of life purely from the evolutionary standpoint. Anyway, so what was that? This single cell, what was it able to do? This ancestor of all ocean plankton, algae, and ultimately flowering plants and trees and rice and sugarcane and everything you eat today, all essentially came from a cell that kidnapped not once but twice. First time mitochondria, second time chloroplast. The chloroplast allowed it to synthesize, take carbon dioxide from the air, and with water turn that into glucose, right, and produce atmospheric oxygen. And by the way, these cells were so successful, they multiplied so quickly at that point of time that the oceans were just filled with them, and our Earth's atmosphere became from 2% oxygen to the 21% oxygen that we have today. Without that increase in oxygen, none of us would have been possible, right? For large animals to evolve, you need more oxygen, right? So again, a very, very central thing, right? So in a sense, another weird thing happened. These things were so successful so fast, and if you understand how evolution works, is that it's not a strategic choice. You try one of many experiments, one works, it reproduces well, you continue down that path. You can't do rewind, you can't do undos like you can do in Microsoft Word, right? So therefore, one of the unfortunate things that happen to plants is that photosynthesis, the chain of reactions, evolved to be really good in a low oxygen atmosphere. But these plants were now generating oxygen. And then once the oxygen levels went up, and all of you know that oxygen is one of the most corrosive molecules out there. I know it's critical for us, we breathe it, but we are finely tuned things that are able to, in a sense, prevent the worst effects of oxygen. But even now, sometimes when you think about food, they will say you should eat antioxidants because they're good for you, right? So the anti-oxygen is right there in the name. Anyway, so what ended up happening to plants is that in a high oxygen atmosphere, photosynthesis became inefficient. Why is that important to us, right? Very simple. You ask any kid out there and ask him whether animals can walk, they can move around, like your cows and goats can go and eat the plants, but the plant cannot walk away and run away, right? When a lion is hunting a deer, the deer can run away. Cow comes to eat grass, the grass cannot run away, right? And if you wonder why there are no walking plants, this is the answer. Because photosynthesis in a high oxygen atmosphere has a very low metabolic throughput, which means that plants, to be able to move, you need an explosive use of energy. And plants don't have that. So plants live in slow motion. That's why trees live thousands of years. Everything in a plant happens in slow motion. Because that's why to see a flower bloom, you have to take a time lapse of 12 hours to see the flower bloom. It's moving just super slowly, right? So why is this important? Because to understand our chicken curry, by the way, I've not forgotten the chicken curry. This is an important point. Plants cannot move. And so they have to defend themselves in completely different ways. Okay? Let's understand the first thing. The first thing they have to do is that they have to store energy during bad conditions. Winter, drought, all kinds of things, right? So one of the mechanisms they evolved is, let me combine multiple glucose molecules that are made from photosynthesis and make it into this really stable, long-term storage. It doesn't spoil at all, and bacteria cannot directly eat it, thing called starch. So all your potatoes, all the rice grains, corn, you name it, anything, any plant, all plants create carbohydrates, right? So that's the first thing. So in your entire chicken curry, anything that involved carbohydrates essentially came from plants, right? So if you are eating the chicken curry with rice, that rice came from this story. Remember I told you that the plant cannot walk up and run away from predators. So what does the plant do? It says, well, I'm not going to take it just like that. So I am going to defend myself using chemical warfare. So plants are the greatest biochemists on the planet. They can produce molecules that we still cannot in a laboratory. Most drugs still require molecules that come from plants or yeast or fungi and so on, right? So plants essentially indulge in chemical warfare. Every time you go to your kitchen and you open a box of spices, you are in effect seeing a bunch of chemical weapons, except that they're not chemical weapons for someone large like you. They are chemical weapons for insects and bacteria and anything else that wants to eat the plant. And every plant has a unique mechanism. I'll give you a few simple examples. Okay? Now, your chili is a great example. Right? So the chili plant produces a molecule called capsaicin, which essentially tricks the nerve endings in your mouth to think that something high temperature is being eaten. Actually high temperature. That's why we use the term hot to describe spicy, the chili hot, right? But it's actually tricking your brain into thinking something hot, and so your brain is sending you extra blood to your face becomes red, you're sweating more to cool you down. Then eventually the brain realizes, this is somebody's crying wolf, it's not really happening. So which is why the more chilies you eat, you get used to the sense of heat. Your brain won't react as much, right? The second interesting thing that actually happens is the fact that the brain will also assume you must be in pain because it's going to trigger all the pain receptors and so on. And so what the brain does when you feel pain is that it will release neurotransmitters that make you feel happy, right? So there is an endorphin rush every time you eat spicy food. Part of the reason why we're addicted to things that are hot and have a lot of chilies is because the fake pain gives you real pleasure, right? So in a sense, that's the example of the chilies. So what's the other thing you use in your chicken curry? Onion. In fact, the first thing, almost 99% of Indian dishes is heat oil, please brown onions, okay? The onion plant actually comes from a family of plants called alliums, the garlic, onion, leeks, what have you. Even incidentally, roughly even asafoetida, right? So people who say, I don't eat onion, I will only eat asafoetida, are effectively consuming very similar flavor molecules. It's just cheating, in the name of religion. Okay? But what's happening here is that the onion plant essentially has a different mechanism of defense. The onion plant essentially, the moment you cut into any cell in your kitchen, the moment you cut into the onion, if you're cutting it from root to stem, you're less likely to cut into a lot of cells. But if you cut it right across, is when you want to cut right through the cells of the onion. The moment the cells are broken, there's an enzyme that says, okay, looks like we're under attack, time to sort of, get into defense mode. It synthesizes a volatile sulfurous molecule called syn-propanethiol oxide. That reaction is long. Everything in a plant is slow, because of photosynthesis. So it takes about 30 seconds for that reaction to complete, and that volatile molecule comes out of the onion and hits the eye of anyone close to it. And that volatile molecule, when it hits your eye, breaks down into dilute sulfuric acid. So onion is literally doing an acid attack every time you try to kill it. Right? For us, we just rub our eyes, we put a fan, we're able to do that, manage all of that. But an insect, a cow, a goat will absolutely stay away because they cannot tolerate that acid attack. Right? So in a sense, every plant has an evolutionary mechanism to protect itself, and this is where. So the story of every spice is the same, right? And some spices are actually quite literally poisonous, right? Strongly poisonous. Clove is a great example. Clove has one of its flavor molecules is called eugenol, right? And eugenol, 100% pure eugenol, is toxic for human beings. Pretty toxic if you ingest a large amount of it. A tiny amount of it is a very strong antibacterial effect, which is exactly why you put it when you have toothache. Because what it does, it will kill all the bacteria in your teeth. Right? So that's why you use cloves as well. But 100% pure eugenol in large quantities is quite poisonous. Something even more poisonous is nutmeg. Right? One of the active molecules in nutmeg is this myristicin, which incidentally, when it gets into your bloodstream, ultimately is a precursor molecule for a rather popular drug called ecstasy. So the effect that nutmeg actually has is like a milder version of taking the drug ecstasy, which is incidentally why in India, mothers will often mix a tiny amount of nutmeg powder into milk to give to children who cry a lot, because it literally makes them high and quieter. Right? So therefore, but if you eat enough nutmeg, you will feel sick. So that's why nutmeg will also say, please be careful, please add a very tiny amount. Because it is, so essentially every plant has a different defense mechanism, and plants trying to protect themselves is literally the fundamental definition of a spice, right? Because what you want, spices are fundamentally not about taste. That's the first thing. Spices are about aromas. Right? We think they're about taste, but we don't smell with our tongues, we smell with our noses, right? So if you have a cold, that's why most food will taste bad, because you can only taste sweet, salt, bitter, and so on, but not really all of the 10,000 different smells that you get from spices, right? So this is the chemical warfare part, right? So now we've got all the plant ingredients. You've got your, what all did we get from plants? Let's assume that you used sesame, right? And you crushed the sesame and got the fat, so that's your oil. You got the onion, you got the garlic, you got ginger, you got turmeric, and you got cumin, coriander, right? And all the other, maybe some fancy spices, you know, your cinnamon and all these other things, right? So you got all the spices you need for your chicken curry, right? Including even things like tomatoes, right? So fun thing about tomatoes is that tomatoes didn't exist in India before 150 years ago. Right? They arrived, they were discovered in Mexico, and the Spanish introduced them to Italy. Italy didn't have tomatoes. Now we associate tomatoes with Italian cuisine, but they didn't actually have them. And then they made their way to India, and they were cultivated along with potatoes and other things only in the late 1850s at scale. Right? So there was no tomatoes in Indian food before that. Okay. So this is the story of all the plants. Okay. Now we need to get to our other ingredient, which is the chicken. Okay. To get to the chicken, if you're wondering why there is a photo of an actual asteroid hitting the Earth, and this actually happened about 65 million years ago, right? While you may not necessarily be familiar with this, you might be familiar with a movie called Jurassic Park, right? Set around the time of the dinosaurs. Jurassic was the time when the dinosaurs were there, but I think the part that the movie doesn't get into is actually the fact that 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit somewhere in Mexico, and this is sort of like a visual rendering of the massive size of that crater. And this attack, this asteroid impact, killed about 90% of all life on the Earth. More importantly, it killed almost every large animal, including all the large dinosaurs. Right? So there was a nuclear winter for the next several millions, hundreds of thousands of years. So nuclear winter means that there is just so much cloud cover and there's so much dust that the sunlight is not able to get in, and so the planet becomes cold. Right? So that's exactly what happened. So a couple of things, interesting things happen. What happens when the Earth becomes very cold? Reptiles cannot survive because they are cold-blooded. So mammals, on the other hand, can survive because they're warm-blooded. They need to keep eating all the time so as to drive that metabolism, but we're warm-blooded, so we're able to survive in a colder planet. Right? Reptiles, large reptiles, very few reptiles survive. You can see some of them, you know, small lizards, you can see turtles, you can see crocodiles survived and so on. But more importantly, another category of reptiles also survived. The ones that could fly. Right? And the ones that could fly, anyway, so everybody thinks that dinosaurs kind of look like this, right? So this is usual artist rendition of what a dinosaur looks like, but scientists now believe they actually look more like that. And you'll kind of get the connection of where I'm going to. Dinosaurs apparently had feathers. But they were not like just all scaly and all that. Some of them had feathers and so on. And some of the flying dinosaurs evolved into birds. So that's how we have birds. Birds' ancestors were flying reptiles. So that's how the bird kingdom essentially came to be. And 10,000 years ago, one of those birds that, fortunately for us, was not very good at flying, called the jungle fowl was captured by a bunch of people in Bihar and Bengal, approximately in that area. Could also be in southern China. Have happened independently as well. And we domesticated this bird. The act of domestication actually means a lot of things. So in the context of plants, it means that if you take a plant that is the wild grass, that is the ancestor of rice, right? It's actually 10 foot tall, almost like a bamboo. And you can barely get 2 or 3 grains in each one. The act of domestication for a plant is to take that one, keep growing it, and see if any of the offspring are giving you more grains and are also shorter. Then you say, no, you know what? I'm going to discard all the rest of them. I'm going to reproduce these till I get the rice that is able to give me this much rice from a single plant and is also only this short. That's how we domesticated plants. With animals, it's very similar. Capture a bunch of jungle fowl. First they discover that, oh, by the way, the eggs are absolutely delicious and so nutritious. The meat is also absolutely perfect. Not very good at flying, so let's get even further. The original jungle fowl, pretty violent, etc. So within a population, you find the ones that are very docile, human-friendly, not great eyesight. That's how we domesticated dogs. Dogs are basically dumb, low IQ wolves. That's basically what they are. So we picked all the characteristics that make it useful for us from the wild version, and that's exactly what we did. So we ended up with what we call the modern day chicken, right? And so that, every time you eat chicken curry now, you know you're eating something that descended from the dinosaurs. Okay. Now, so this is how you see the connection, right? So now this chicken, we kind of spoke about carbohydrates, right? Plants, because they don't move, it does not make sense for them to invest in making bodies out of protein. Remember, carbohydrates are relatively simple molecules. So you can put one glucose, create a big polymer, you get starch. Okay. Just different ways in which you polymerize, you get different starches. Cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin, all the rest of that stuff, right? Some we can digest, some, only a cow can digest. But if something has to move, it needs a different body. It needs a body that is flexible. It needs a body that can stretch, a body that can bend, the body that can squeeze. And you can't do that with starch and carbohydrates. So essentially you need protein, right? So muscles are made of protein because these are large molecules that have large complicated shapes that can take different forms based on based on physical activity and other enzymatic activity and fuel and so on. And so that's how essentially bones and tendons and connective tissue and muscle evolved. And in the context of food, you kind of know therefore why meat tastes the way it does, right? Plants, vegetables have a firm texture when they're fresh, and your meat actually has a softer texture, right? Plants become soft when cooked, meat becomes hard when cooked, right? So these are all the sorts of distinctions because you can now trace back every single one of this to the first cell that kidnapped that chloroplast and the mitochondria 2.7 billion years ago, right? So now we've got the ingredients. So we got the sesame oil, we got all the spices, we got the curry leaves, we got the cumin and coriander and cloves and pepper and all the rest of these things, right? Chilies and so on. And then we now got the chicken as well, right? We got the protein, we got the carbohydrates, we got the spices. And obviously you need salt. Salt is the only inorganic substance that we actually eat and absolutely essentially require. So we got that from the oceans. And essentially, we've now essentially got to the point where we've prepped everything, we're in the kitchen. At that point is when you have to think about, well, now I've evolutionary biology lesson over, basic biochemistry, anatomy lesson over, basic botany lesson over. Now we need to get to thermodynamics, right? So I'm in the kitchen. You really have to think about, well, what material do I use? Do I use clay? Do I use metal? What's the difference? Why do we now use more metal? What's the difference between aluminium and cast iron and so on? Despite all the nonsense you will see on social media about clay being better and you must not use aluminium and so on, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is, some metals are fantastic conductors of heat, like aluminium and copper. Copper is anyway too expensive. Aluminium is a super conductor of heat, but also will lose heat very quickly. Also heats very evenly. Cast iron takes a long time to heat, but will also heat unevenly. Stainless steel, kind of relatively easy to maintain, etc., but heats very unevenly. Right? But does retain heat depending on the quality of the material. And something like clay, etc., takes a much, much longer time to heat, but will hold heat for a very, very long time. Right? So those are the different ways. So you determine, based on, obviously, mankind started with clay, but then we obviously, the first time we were able to figure out copper, it was called the Bronze Age, we were using brass and bronze. And then the Iron Age, that's why we moved to iron and then steel. And that's essentially where we are. And aluminium is a relatively recent, last 200 years phenomenon. Aluminium is one of the most abundant metals on the Earth's surface, right? So it is, while only the process of extracting it is difficult, but essentially it is, right? So this is the whole thermodynamics of. So if you want to quickly grill something so that it becomes browning even and very rapidly, you want to do that, you use aluminium. But if you're making a gravy where it is slowly simmering for a long amount of time, you want to use something that's not aluminium. Right? Because aluminium will react with acids in your food, and acids are anything that is sour is an acid. Right? Tamarind, tartaric acid. Tomatoes, malic acid. Right? Lime juice, citric acid. Right? Every one of these, vinegar, acetic acid. So all of these are acids. So acids will leach the aluminium, in fact even iron as well, into the food. Leaching iron into the food, okay. Leaching aluminium, not so great. Right? So you want to use aluminium for dry dishes. You want to use non-aluminium for gravy dishes where you cook for a long amount of time and so on. Right? So that's the materials. And then you kind of have, then you need to think about how is heat transferred. Right? Before vessels were there, human beings would just take the food, cook it on a stick, directly put it on the flame, wait for it to cook, and then you eat it. So that's essentially how they cooked. Hello. So that is direct transfer of heat, right? But the interesting thing is that when you keep a metal, the heat is transferred from the metal to your food via something called conduction. When you cook something in a gravy, when you're making sambar, kodambu, chicken curry, etc., the heat is transferred via conduction only to the bottom part of the liquid. The rest of the food is getting heated by the liquid water around it. Either water, or when you're deep frying something, the medium is fat. The difference between fat and water is that fat has a high smoke point. So you can cook food at like 180, 170 Celsius. Water, as long as it's liquid, will not cross 100 Celsius because that's the boiling point, right? So therefore, when you want to cook at very high temperatures, you deep fry. That's why you use only fat. When you want to cook at low temperatures, you use water, right? Now, and this medium of heat transfer is called convection. Okay. Now, again, for very simple, it's, you might have realized, when something is at 100 Celsius, when a metal, when plate or a vessel is at 100 Celsius, if you touch it, your hands will burn. It'll actually, your hands will burn, right? If you put your hand inside water that is boiling around 100 Celsius, you will get slightly burnt, but it will not be as bad as touching the metal, right? But if an oven says 100 Celsius and you put your hand inside, you won't feel anything. It will just feel mildly warm, right? Simple physics again. There are solids are more dense than liquids. Liquids are more dense than gas. So solids transfer a lot more energy in a lot quicker time to you than a liquid does. Likewise a gas, right? So this is why it's quicker to cook on your stove than in an oven. An oven takes a much longer time to cook because the medium is air and the way you cook is convection. There is a fourth way of doing this using radiation, which is essentially in an oven there is something called a broiler light that essentially glows red, and that's putting out infrared, and that infrared can directly heat your food, no medium is required. The other way in which we use electromagnetic radiation is microwave. Like infrared is still high energy, microwave is very low energy radiation and it can only heat water. That's why microwave you can only heat stuff that has water. Almost all food has water, right? We are also mostly water, right? And most of the things we eat are also mostly water, right? So that's why conduction, convection, you sort of choose which way you want. Then we kind of get to how do flavors actually get absorbed into your food? You've added all the spices. What happens to all of the spices? Have all of those molecules locked up inside them. What's actually happening, right? So what happens is that when heat is applied, the bonds actually break. A lot of the volatile molecules will get released. So again, think back logically. If a plant has to defend itself with poisons, what it cannot do is produce water-soluble poisons, because then one rain will wash everything away. Okay. So all of the spices tend to have flavors that are fat-soluble. They are not water-soluble. So that's why all Indian cooking starts with hot oil and then spices. The goal of that oil is, you give me the spices, I will extract all of the essential aromas, prevent it from escaping into the air, and put them into the oil. Now it's in the oil. After that, you can even discard the spices. This is why I always get annoyed when I order biryani and there are these giant pieces of star anise and cinnamon and all. They have nothing. All the flavors have already gone into the oil, right? You can actually discard them. Right? So anyway, so the point is that fats are where flavors are absorbed, not water. Right? So in another funny way, when you go to a kitchen and you smell something amazing, all those smells are lost from the food. What you're actually smelling is flavor that could have been inside the food, now it's now been lost to the air. Okay, so that's essentially what you're smelling, right? So do not underestimate a kitchen where you don't smell much. It means the cook knows exactly what they're doing. Okay. So this is one element, right? So the other very common fallacy here, which we'll anyway get into one of the common misconceptions, is the fact that we think that you can take rice, you can take meat, you can take whatever, and spices will get absorbed by the dish the longer you cook. Again, it doesn't work that way. As I said, if you apply ginger garlic paste on your skin, if you believe ginger garlic flavors will seep inside your body, and if you don't think that will happen, then it works the same way for anything else, because all cells roughly work the same way, right? Cell membranes do not allow strange large chemicals to come inside them. The only thing that can break through a cell wall are things like salt. That's why we have something called osmosis, right? So there is osmotic pressure. So if you have something salty on the outside, salt will go inside till the salt concentration is the same on both sides, if there is a semi-permeable membrane, right? Giant flavor molecules inside these spices cannot actually go inside. That's just not how it works, right? So flavor absorption, you have to understand, largely happens when spice flavors dissolve in oil. Okay? The other thing is that as human beings, you also have to realize that, we spoke about the first kidnapping that happened, the one cell kidnapped another, then photosynthesis happened, then the asteroid impact happened, which resulted in dinosaurs dying and therefore birds evolving, and then mammals becoming stronger than reptiles, us domesticating these birds, getting agriculture, domesticating plants, ultimately making chicken curry. All that is fine, but at some point of time when we discovered fire, and therefore we discovered cooking, right? As you might imagine, our closest cousins, chimpanzees, gorillas, don't eat cooked food. They eat raw food. Right? The distinction between raw and cooked food is that cooking is essentially the outsourcing of digestion. Whatever work your body has to do to break large molecules into small, that's the goal of digestion. You have to break large molecules into small molecules that your body can absorb. Amino acids, fatty acids, sugars. Basically three things, and obviously micronutrients like vitamins, minerals, and so on. That is just how it works. So if you can do the breaking outside of your body, then it means that your body doesn't have to spend all that energy. Right? So a cow has to spend 4 days to digest the grass that it eats, and it gets very, very little energy. So if you take a herbivore like a rhino, it has to eat 2 tons of grass to get the same amount of energy that you eat, that you can get by eating one sundal in Marina Beach. Because why? That is boiled, it's pre-selected, you're only taking the seeds, you're making life easier for you to absorb and so on. And some, especially hyper-processed food like potato chips and say French fries, the absorption is even quicker, faster. Your body has to do little or no work. Right? I mean, that is also the cause of metabolic diseases that we'll get to eventually. Right? So fundamentally, think about it, the amount of effort your body has to do is fundamentally small. So cooking is the ability to make large molecules into small molecules outside. So what ended up happening to human beings is that, oh, because we don't have to, we have to spend a fraction of the energy digesting food that a chimpanzee has to. Our brains evolved to be much bigger because your body can focus on two other important things, reproduction and brains. So human beings outpopulated chimpanzees 2-3 million years ago. Simply because they were cooking food, so they were able to focus more on reproducing. Their population grew faster, and they were also able to coordinate and build better tools and so on, right? A chimpanzee infant and a human infant. A chimpanzee infant is 10 times smarter than a human infant when it comes to logic problem solving. There are enough videos on YouTube you can watch. But then by the age of 5 or 6, humans outperform chimpanzees in no time, right? That again is because of another reason. Because human babies are actually significantly born prematurely, and human babies are completely helpless for years, whereas a deer has to start walking and manage itself literally a few minutes after it's born, right? So those are all the advantages of human beings and so on, and cooking has played a significant role in doing that, right? Now we come to the other element of flavor, which is that anytime the color brown is seen in the kitchen is when flavor happens. Okay. And here's the funny thing. Brown only happens above the boiling point of water. Brown only happens when proteins react with sugars at temperatures at 110 and above, which means you can't have water. So only when things are dry on the surface is when things become brown. And that's a reaction called the Maillard reaction. And every time that happens, you produce a spectacular range of flavors, right? That's why your chapati is brown. That's why your coffee is brown. That's why chocolate is brown. And in a very bizarre, dark way, it's also why we age. Right? The sugars in our own bodies react with the proteins in our own bodies over a long period of time to create molecules that are not good for us. So in a weird way, the reaction that makes food absolutely delicious is the same reaction that also significantly sort of contributes to our own aging. Right? So it's a very interesting sort of a dilemma there. But so which kind of also brings us to why now you know exactly why vegetables taste the way they do. They're made of largely carbohydrates, so they are crunchier, harder, and starchier. And meat is soft, pliable, flexible, largely made of protein and fat. Plants made of carbohydrates, meat is made of protein and fat, right? So that's basically the distinction, and there are a few other differences. Plant material becomes softer when you cook, meat becomes harder when you cook. Why? Because the proteins are complex structures. When you heat them, they break. It's called denaturing. So the molecular changes don't happen, but the 3D structure change happens. It becomes simpler strands that are packed together. They squeeze out water. They become harder. Right? Anybody who's cooking chicken will know that this happens very regularly. Right? The part of the chicken we end up eating, the breast meat, barely gets any exercise, and so loses water very quickly. The moment you cook it, it becomes like rubber. So we'll get to some tips and tricks on how to avoid that, but for now let's stick with the science. So we spoke about microwave, right? Now you're done with cooking, right? Now you're going to actually experience the chicken. You can smell it. You've got the rice. You've poured the curry on it. You're just about to eat it. Let's understand how we actually experience that, right? So everybody uses the word taste. Taste is something that happens with the taste buds on your tongue. We know of 5 kinds of taste buds. We believe there may be a couple of other kinds also, but we broadly know 5, right? Sweet, salt, bitter, sour, and umami. Simple science of it, salt taste bud detects sodium. Anything that has sodium will taste salty, right? That's why MSG also tastes salty. That's also sodium bicarbonate, also tastes salty. And by the way, forget sodium, even potassium will trick that receptor a little bit, but a little bit less effectively. So potassium chloride also tastes mildly salty, which is why people with hypertension are given low sodium salt, which is a mix of sodium chloride and potassium chloride. 100% potassium chloride, incidentally, is what is used in the US justice system to stop your heart. So 100% potassium chloride is lethal. Okay? So interesting thing, so that is salt. Sweet is basically the detection of sugars. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, all common simple sugars. The moment the molecule becomes large, it won't trigger the sweet receptor. That's why potato doesn't taste sweet, but sugar tastes sweet, right? But here's the interesting thing. Next time you eat a French fry, try and chew on the French fry for about 5 minutes. It will start to taste sweet. because the enzyme in your mouth will break down the starch into glucose and you will then taste that glucose. Here's an even more fun experiment. If you eat things like gooseberry, nelica, or lime, or any kind of sour thing, anything that typically has citric acid, right? Mangoes, gooseberry, lemons, and so on, and then you drink water, it will taste sweet. If you wondered why that happens, it happens because citric acid is it's an acid. So it will trigger the sour taste buds. Sour taste buds are basically proton detectors. Acids are basically things that give protons. So proton detection is essentially acid detection. More protons, it will taste sour. You get that tingling sensation. So something is sour, right? And what happens with citric acid is that citric acid, the molecular shape also happens to trigger the sweet taste buds because of its shape. By the way, alcohol also does the same thing. Okay? That's why alcohol sometimes will taste sweet. Right? So the citric acid also triggers the same taste bud. But when it is too acidic, as well as this, your brain will look at both the signals and say, no, I can't deal with both. I'm going to tell you that this is sour. It will ignore the signals coming from the sweet taste bud. The moment you drink water, you're diluting the acid. And at that point, the brain will tell you, yeah, this is sweet. So again, it's an interesting way for you to really realize that the way we experience flavors, they're not set in stone at all. And you can completely hack them, and I'll show you several interesting examples. Right? Now, flavor ultimately is taste: sweet, salt, sour, bitter. Bitter is essentially taste buds that we originally have to detect poisons, because poisons tend to be bitter. Okay? And umami. Umami is basically a taste bud primarily to detect glutamates, which is an amino acid. So largely we believe it is there for us to develop a taste for meat, for protein, high protein rich foods. Right? So that's why when you eat anything that's been cooked in a lot of bones, bone broth, paya, etc., those will have the umami, savory, even chicken curry, prawns, all of these, mushrooms, tomatoes, all of these tend to have a lot of glutamates. Right? So for those of you worried that MSG is very evil, etc., etc., you're eating far more MSG when you eat tomatoes and mushrooms and Parmesan cheese and chicken and prawns or anything. So you shouldn't be worried about the tiny amount of MSG in Chinese food anyway, right? So that is the third part is, what does the food actually feel like? So you have nerve endings. So I'll often ask people, what is the taste of chilies? So when I ask people for the taste of chilies, people will tell me, no, it's hot. I said, that's not a taste. Taste is only sweet, salt, sour, bitter, umami. That's it. Only these 5 things are tastes. So what is the thing that gives the sensation of hot? That's one thing. So the taste of a chili is actually bitter. Why? Because anything that is green in color will be bitter. That's just the way it is, right? Any leaf, any kire, any palak, the reason why kids don't like it is that at the end of the day it is bitter. We then add oil and add other things to make it palatable, but basically anything green will be bitter, right? In varying degrees. So chilies are actually bitter. Okay? But the capsaicin triggers your nerve endings, and that is what dominates the entire this thing. So that is why you are essentially feeling that the heat sensation, you're not really tasting the bitterness. So that's why capsicum tastes bitter, because it doesn't have the heat. So you only taste the bitterness, right? So the other interesting thing is that mouthfeel also means things like, is it crispy? How much water does it have? So that again is an evolutionary way in which we detect the difference between a fresh fruit and a rotten fruit. So anything is crunchy, it is tastier. Anything that is soft is more likely to be rotten, and it might cause food poisoning. So it's a conditioning. So that's why we have a preference for crisp potato chips versus a soggy potato chip. Although chemically they're both the same, we can still tell the difference between a crisp potato chip and a soggy potato chip, right? Now, the last element is that if you think you taste only with your tongue, no. You have taste buds all through your digestive system, right in your small intestine as well. That this is precisely why one of the interesting things that happens is that for people who are using artificial sweeteners, right, like your sugar-free, if you're diabetic, I think it's absolutely fine, it's necessary. But if you're using sucralose, if you're using aspartame and acesulfame and any of these other sweeteners, think about what's actually happening. The molecule is designed to fit into your taste bud here and say, oh, this is amazingly sweet. So the brain is being told, in about half an hour, you're going to get so many calories. Be prepared, right? So if your cells in the intestine are like waiting for the buffet to arrive. And then this arrives and they're like, I've been cheated. So I did not get any calories from this. What nonsense is this? So it will then trigger the brain and say, eat more. Right? So part of the problem with long-term consumption of these kinds of sugar sweeteners is that you end up having cravings. You end up going eating other things. Right? So, and also what ends up happening is that much of the food you eat is also feeding your gut bacteria. And if you continue eating things that your gut bacteria cannot eat, they will also die, and that also causes other problems. So anyway, so long story short, you taste, there are taste receptors all through your body, right? And by the way, because how do you know chili is actually a nerve-ending thing? Which is why if you rub chilies on your hand, it will burn. The same nerve ending is here that is there inside your mouth. That's why it burns everywhere, right? So that's how chilies work. Now the interesting thing is that there's something called a pepper spray that often will be used as self-defense, typically by women, attacking them, you spray that. It's essentially concentrated capsaicin from chilies. Why do you think that is used? And not something like, say, sulfuric acid or something, right? Because capsaicin is a remarkable molecule that you can disable that person, because the nerve endings will think the eye is on fire and shut everything down, and then 10 minutes later the brain will say, this seems okay, and the guy will recover. So this is a way to incapacitate a person without actually harming the person. So that's why we use chilies. Here's another use of chilies you might not have realized. When you apply Iodex, Amrutanjan, any of your pain relief balms, Tiger Balm, etc. Next time you see Tiger Balm, please see the ingredient list. It will say capsaicin extract. It is again literally concentrate capsaicin from chilies. What does it actually do is that it really irritates the place where you have a pain. The nerve endings are now saying, I'm having some pain, so I'm inflamed. Now this guy is putting some chilies there. So the brain is like, okay, now I have two sources of pain. What should I focus on? Let me focus on the chili pain. So it will focus on the chili pain, and then it will realize that, that's not really a pain. It will give you some temporary relief. So this is a classic example of something that actually does not fix the problem at all, but it's a way of really distracting. These are called counter irritants. So there's a category of medicines called counter irritants that use. So every time when you drink ginger to soothe your throat, you're not soothing your throat. The molecule in ginger is irritating your throat in another way. That is confusing your brain into thinking there is another problem that I have to solve. So it spread its attention. So you see a temporary relief in your actual pain while it's dealing with ginger. Half an hour later, it realizes the ginger thing is a fake problem anyway. Then it will start focusing on your pain. So that's why all these inji tea and all of that stuff is only temporary relief. It doesn't really fix any of your problems. Okay. So fermentation is another element. So fermentation again is more remarkable human ingenuity in saying that, okay, I'm going to use cooking to break down molecules. But I can only do so much because it's crude. You can heat something, you can squeeze some acids, you can do cut vegetables, you can only do basic things. But if I can somehow tame and domesticate some bacteria and fungi friendly to me, they can do molecular gastronomy because they can make changes at a molecular level that I cannot do with cooking. Because the lactobacillus that you add to milk can go change the structure of the milk. It can eat all of the lactose, convert it into lactic acid, which makes curd yogurt, and also cause all of the casein proteins to curdle up so that you get thick curd, lasts much longer, otherwise milk would spoil. Or I can ferment something like grains, create a lot of air bubbles to bake bread, or the same thing with idli and so on. All of that means that I'm now not only domesticated animals, I've not just domesticated plants, we've also domesticated microbes. Microbes that are friendly to us. There are some yeast and some bacteria that are friendly to us that we are able to use. Again, outsourcing digestion outside. And by the way, because they operate at a molecular level, they can unlock a lot more things. So the urad dal, before it was made into idli, gives you very little nutrition, micronutrients, particularly vitamin B, certain essential amino acids. The moment you let the bacteria loose on it and it ferments it, a lot more amino acids, a lot more umami, a lot more glutamates, all of these things are released. And that's why idli is generally more digestible than just a raw urad dal, right? So that's why your idli is relatively slightly more healthier than your vada. Okay. Now comes the really interesting part. Okay. The interesting part is this. The interesting part is that all of this is very straightforward science. You know how your body works, you know how taste buds work, you know your nose is able to detect 10,000 different aromas. It can tell the difference between the aroma of a clove versus aroma of cinnamon and so on. But it can also be completely fooled. Right? So, and that is very important for us to understand. Right? So the sound of food also plays a key role in how you perceive flavor. Okay? So every one of you has been on a flight and eaten food in a flight. You will know that the food in flight is always taste bad. You wondered why. I mean, of course, it's some Taj cook who's making fantastic food. Why does the food in an airplane taste bad? The answer is actually engine noise. So it turns out that unless you can hear the sound of you eating into crispy food, your brain will tell you that this is not good food. This is not high flavor. Right? So what ends up happening in an airplane is that the amount of white noise is so high is that you cannot really appreciate crispy food. The second thing that happens is that the air pressure in an airplane is much lower than that of your at sea level. Although it is a pressurized cabin, they to save money, they don't keep the pressure at atmospheric pressure. It is still lower than your sea level, atmospheric pressure that's or at sea level and so on. At low pressure, your taste buds don't work very well. And here's the really funny thing. Okay? Your sweet and salt taste buds don't work very well, but your umami taste buds work much better. So if you want to really enjoy airplane food, don't order vegetarian. Airplane is where you will enjoy the chicken curry or the prawn or any of these other things, because anything that is high on umami is going to taste better inside a plane. And again, don't try and order things that are crispy, because the engine noise you can't hear. If you want to enjoy food, here's what you do. Get a noise cancelling earphones when you're eating food in an airplane. You will find that the food actually tastes better. So, the interesting thing, that if you look at the global sales of tomato juice, 70% of tomato juices are consumed in flight. Why? Because on the ground it is too sour, too salty. But because you can't really taste too sour, too salty, at that, it's just right. So the most common cocktail in a plane is Bloody Mary. Nobody orders Bloody Mary on the ground, right? So so sound plays a very key role in how you appreciate food. The other thing is actually interesting association is color. Over the years, our brain associates green with bitter. The moment you see anything green, it's bitter. In fact, kids, they see anything green on their plate, they will take it and keep it aside. They just know, it's evolutionary conditioning. They know it's going to be bitter, right? So they will just keep it aside. So you want to give them vegetables that are not green. That's why potato, carrot, and things like that. Or deep fry that vendaka till it is absolutely black, then they will eat it. So that is how you get kids to eat vegetables. Okay? So green is associated with bitterness. Yellow is associated with sourness. And red is associated with sweetness, and brown is associated with savoriness and umami and so on, right? So this is again something that restaurants and others regularly use to hack your brains. So they can use ambient lighting in buffets, in restaurants, to make it, to highlight certain tastes, right? So here's a classic example. If you are someone who's looking to reduce your sugar consumption, saying that, oh, I'm afraid I might be pre-diabetic and so on, I want to consume less sugar, but I can't enjoy my coffee and tea without that sugar. It's very interesting. Change your white cup to a red cup. If you drink coffee or tea from a red cup, researchers have found out that it tastes sweeter than it actually is. So you can get away by adding lesser sugar. So you can reduce your sugar by half, but use a red cup. And the red color amplifies the sensation of sugar. So that's how we are so delusional in our brains that they can be hacked that easily. So color is another interesting way in which you can hack your entire thing. Shape is another very weird thing that we've discovered, right? Again, all this is evolutionary. Okay? Straight shapes tend to taste less sweeter than rounded and curved shapes. And this was famously enough, some of you here are young, so all of you have had Cadbury's chocolates, dairy milk. Okay. So you've had dairy milk chocolate. Have you seen the shape of the dairy milk chocolate? Each one is now rounded. But those of you who are older, like me, will remember that in the 1980s and 90s, dairy milk was not rounded. It was dead straight shapes. Okay. At some time in the 2000s, they changed, and the change had to do with cost. Okay. So those of you, since we are at the Mathematical Institute of Mathematical Sciences, you know, the given volume of something that is with straight lines tends to be more than something with curved lines. So if it's curved, you can save a little bit of volume. So Cadbury saved millions and millions of pounds by making the shape slightly rounded but keeping the overall dimensions the same. So they actually, at scale, they saved a lot of money. Right? So because it was a bad economy and so on. And that's all they did. They did not change the recipe. They just changed it to a rounder shape. Thousands of people in the UK wrote to Cadbury and said, we hate the new dairy milk, it is too sweet. Your earlier one was perfect. And they were like, what? I mean, no, we have not changed the recipe, it's exactly the same, all we changed is the shape. And then eventually research found out that straight line shapes don't trigger the sweet receptors as well as rounded shapes do. Right? And so therefore, they had to adjust, they had to cut down the amount of sugar to adjust it so that it now has the same kind of flavor as the previous one. Right? So what is amazing is that this actually happened to Cadbury's dairy milk. And again, you can also kind of see, if you make sweets that are rounded in shape, you can get away with adding relatively less sugar. Right? One of the problems with Indian sweets, all your kaju, katli, everything are all angular shapes. They all have like insane amounts of sugar. Right? So this is something we have to tell all our sweet guys to really change. The other interesting thing is that if you've seen ads for food, every time you see Instagram and you see some food, immediately you'll start salivating. Right? And specifically there's something called protein in motion. Okay? The moment you see any sort of meat-based dish, which is sort of spinning, the camera spinning and it's moving, etc., apparently makes you feel more hungry than if it's just a still photo. The reason for that is because we largely evolved as hunter-gatherers, and for most of our history, the idea of seeing an animal move is basically protein in motion. So next time you see an Instagram ad with some chicken and some crispy thing rotating, it's your few ancestor from tens of thousands of years ago salivating at a deer that is just running and they're just going to hunt it. It's that same sensation that you're actually kind of having. So movement also changes the way. So that is why sizzlers and many of these other things now incorporate sort of movement into how you do that. The other thing is that if you are in a good mood, your sweet taste buds work better. If you're in a bad mood, your bitter and sour taste buds work better. It's not surprising that we use the term sour and bitter to actually describe those negative emotions, right? They literally come from the fact that it is literally what they call a bad taste in the mouth. It's literally quite metaphorically the same thing. So on the day when CSK wins a match and you eat some food, it will taste sweeter. Right? On the day they lose, it will actually genuinely taste more bitter and sour. Right? So this has been, again, so this is, so it's quite interesting. So all of this also means that you can prime yourself to change many of your eating behaviors. Right? For example, using a smaller plate. Right? If you go to a restaurant, buffet will have a smaller size plate than the plate they keep on your table. Because people feel guilty about going second time. So smaller plate, people eat smaller amounts. You can use the same technique at home. Actually, if you buy yourself, if you want to eat less, the simplest hack you can do is get smaller plates. Right? And so the other thing is colors. You can prime yourself by using a red plate. You can automatically prime yourself to find more sweetness, etc., and reduce the amount of carbohydrates and increase your protein intake. Right? If you use a red plate, for example. Right? So these are many ways in which you can prime yourself and so on, and watch out. So here's an interesting thing. When you actually bite into a potato chip, okay, that sound is actually, by the way, incredibly loud. Don't quite realize it. It can go up to 100 decibels. When you crunch into a really crisp potato chip, the inner sound is sometimes over 100 decibels, and it travels via the bone, right? So even people who cannot hear can still taste crispness because they can feel it through the bone. right? So many of those frequencies travel through the bone. Now, what is really fascinating is that your hearing associates high frequency noises with freshness, low frequency noises with something else. Okay? High frequency noises. So, why do you think potato chips packets are famously super noisy? No matter what you do, it's in a quiet and you want to open, it will always make a ton of high frequency noise. They're very deliberately designed because all of that high frequency noise enhances your sense of crispness. So even if the chips is slightly low quality, soggy, not very crisp, the noise that the packet will make you think that it is actually crisper than it actually is. Right? So this is again another way in which you can be fooled. Okay? So now with that, we kind of come to the point where that's how essentially we went from 2.7 billion years ago, one kidnapping of one cell ultimately led to the chicken curry that we ultimately made and we enjoyed and we experienced and so on. Now what I'll do is kind of, go through some broad sort of misconceptions, popular misconceptions, and then we'll get into Q&A. Right? So the first thing is obviously some illustrations from the book. This is essentially a very simple depiction of the Maillard reaction. When sugars and amino acids react at high temperatures, they produce a range of molecules that have spectacular flavors. Roasty, toasty, nutty, caramelly, savory, meaty, herby sort of flavors. Every time you grill chicken, you fry a puri, all of these things, or when bread is baking, all of these things actually happen. And so as I say, right, so as you can see, those things that are walking away sad at the bottom are water molecules. So water is lost in this reaction, and then this is what actually happens. So reducing the reaction, right? So now, a couple of other interesting things that happen, right? Many of you might be students, and the best way to boil an egg is actually to use a steam rather than put it in water, because it's a more gentle, more consistent way of actually boiling eggs, right? And you have to remember that protein cooks at a lower temperature than carbohydrates. If you ask people what takes, whether meat cooks at a lower temperature or vegetables, they immediately say vegetables. No, it's wrong. Starch actually cooks at a higher temperature. In fact, red meat cooks at an even lower temperature because the reason chicken has to be cooked at a high temperature because it may have salmonella, and you need to kill salmonella. On the other hand, pork and beef, etc., can be cooked literally at 50, 52 Celsius. That's why you can have rare steaks and so on, right? So egg proteins start setting at about 62 Celsius. The yolk and the white set at different temperatures. So somehow you have to get the temperature between 62 to 66, or you will end up with the classic Chennai mutta biryani egg, which is literally inside will be green. You know what is the green color when you see a boiled egg? That is ferrous sulfide. So it's so overboiled that the sulfur in the white was literally reacted with the iron in the yolk to produce ferrous sulfide, which is green color. If you see green, it means it is overboiled, right? So, and again, it doesn't smell good either, right? So that's also the problem, because when ferrous sulfide is produced, a tiny amount of hydrogen sulfide is produced. That's the smell of eggs, right? Which is why if you soft cook eggs, they don't smell like eggs at all. So part of my way of actually convincing people who don't eat eggs to eat eggs is to make them eat undercooked eggs. They're like, oh, this doesn't taste like eggs. Yeah, because we've not produced hydrogen sulfide, it will not taste like eggs, right? So this is the one, right? Now, another interesting tip, you want to make the most amazing omelette of your life, add salt to the eggs and wait half an hour. Then make the omelette. The salt will break some of the proteins ahead of time, so when you cook the omelette, it takes a little bit more time to reassemble so that you're less likely to overcook your omelette. So you get a super soft textured omelette as opposed to a rubbery texture if you actually add salt half an hour, 15 to half an hour ahead. Right? So this is obviously, this is how capsaicin works. And these are all illustrations that I've done for the book as well as the in media and so on. Right. So a couple of other ways of thinking about food is broadly that people tend to think in terms of recipes. And as a software guy, I realized that no, that's not a very efficient way to think about food. I would rather think of them as algorithms. So if I essentially say that just say 6 broad examples, right? One is a basic North Indian makhani, bhuna, kurma, chettinad, malabar. And that's how, there is an oil tadka, you pick oil. If it is Kerala, you put coconut oil. If it's Tamil Nadu, you put sesame oil. If it's Bengal, you put mustard oil, right? That's really all that matters. So here's the interesting thing. In India, you choose the right regional fat and those spices. No matter what you do afterwards, it will taste of that region. Okay? So you can take any recipe you want, but if you start with coconut oil, curry leaves, ginger, garlic, cumin, etc., it will taste Kerala no matter what you do afterwards. Right? Same thing with if you take sesame oil, kalpasi and red chilies, fennel, sombu and all of that, it will taste chettinad no matter what you do after that. So you can take any dish from anywhere and convert it to your local region by just changing the fat and the spices. It doesn't really matter. So the other thing is that you can have different spice powders mixes, right? So each of these will give a different set of aromas and so on. And this is an algorithm for how you make the Tamil Nadu famous variety rice, which is you pressure cook the rice, you make a flavor base, you add spice powders, add the cooked rice, salt and tadka. That's it, right? Any combination. And to do that. Pulao, only difference is that you have to cook the rice along with the flavors. Whereas in variety rice, you cook the rice separately and then you mix. That's sort of like the difference, if you will, right? And this is basically the dal algorithm, right? Basic dal, sour dal, kutu is also a kind of dal. Sambar is also a kind of dal. Right? This is yogurt gravies. If you whisk your yogurt with rice flour in South India, gram flour in North India, and then you can get a basic morkorambu, pulisheri, or an elaborate Punjabi curry. Same principle. And you can go one step ahead. So this is actually there on Google Sheets. This is a complete chutney recipe generator. Right? So a chutney is made up of cooked ingredients, raw ingredients, nutty stuff, herbs, salt, acid, sweet, tempering. And you can hit Command R and to generate a chutney recipe if you're feeling lucky, if you will, right? So that's basically the so don't be restricted in terms of how you think about, I must only follow my mother's recipes or my grandmother's recipes and so on. So there's so much experimentation that you can actually do if you think in terms of these large boxes. Right? So I once made a rasam, and this is how I made it, right? It might seem very alien to you. What I did, it's there on YouTube, you can watch it. So what I did is that I took apple cider vinegar, added water, and to that I added a bunch of spices, typical spice powders, coriander, chilies, curry leaves, asafoetida, and boiled it. And then I added green apple juice, right? Green apple juice, and then a few pieces of actual green apple, and then tadka at the end. And I sort of gave it to my mother and said, ask her what do you think this is? She said it's like a rasam, right? Then I asked her that, do you like vinegar? She said, no, I hate vinegar. I said, this is made with vinegar. Because it turns out that acids are acids. It doesn't really matter. Your taste buds deal with it the same way. Whether it's tartaric acid or acetic acid or malic acid, only strength, pH level matters. Okay? Otherwise, it doesn't really matter as much. Okay? So sometimes something like a mango has a mix of acids, so which is why when you make something like, say, a mean manga curry, which is so much richer because a mango brings a ton of other flavors in addition to the acids. So that, as opposed to, say, a tamarind, which is only very one-dimensional, right? Or the most one-dimensional is obviously vinegar. Right? Apple cider vinegar is slightly more complicated because it also brings some of the flavors of the apple, right? So, which is why a pineapple rasam works, because pineapple again has citric acid and a bunch of those same acids, and so it works. But if you want to make watermelon rasam, you have to remember that the watermelon has no acid. It's not sour at all. So you do have to add tamarind. You do have to add something else. Other thing that I did is that you skip the tamarind and take amchur powder and just boil it in water. You can make rasam as well, and you won't be able to tell the difference, right? So the point is that you can really experiment when you really think in terms of these kinds of things, right? And again, salt, right? There is table salt, there's black salt, soy sauce has salt, right? And if you don't mind, the Thai and Chinese cooking has fish sauce, which also is salty and brings a fantastic umami flavor and so on, right? Some common misconceptions that I'll get to, and then we'll do questions, right? So a very common misconception is, how many of you in this room have ever read the instruction manual of a pressure cooker? Clearly no one, right? Neither have I, right? But once for the research of my book, I eventually did. And I found out that every pressure cooker has a manual that says that Please seal it, bring it to 1 whistle, then reduce the heat, and then measure time. That's what they say. Nobody follows that. Everybody is like, no, 3 whistles, 5 whistles, 12 whistles for chana, 20 whistles for urad dal. I mean, so that is essentially how people think, because in India, everyone is using the same stove, same high heat. So number of whistles effectively became a measure of time, effectively. So it worked, right? But now it's failing because people are using induction, and induction puts out twice as much, heats twice as fast as your regular stuff, right? Because it's induction for the physics is basically, it induces currents in the metal, and so the metal heats itself resistively. So it is super fast. It heats up water twice as fast, right? So 3 whistles, rice in induction cooker is uncooked rice. 5 whistles is completely raw dal. Okay. So which is why you now have to think in terms of bring it to 1 whistle, reduce the heat. So what's actually happening is that pressure is building up to 1 bar above atmospheric pressure, so that the weight is calibrated, so that it goes above that, it will release the excess pressure and it will fall back down. That's what a whistle is. If you heat it again, then the whistle will go up again. That's really what's happening. So really, cooking is a function of how long it's spent at peak pressure, not number of whistles. So which is why what you have to do is that you use like 6 minutes for rice, 9 minutes for dal, 12 minutes for chana dal, and then 15 minutes for chana, maybe 18 minutes for rajma, and maybe 20 minutes for really old chana. Maybe you found it in a shelf, chana rajma which you didn't use for 1 year. That will take a lot more time to cook, right? So you want to use that. And another thing you can use is add a pinch of baking soda, because baking soda breaks the pectin in cell walls. So if you want to cook these dals quicker, a pinch of baking soda, it's completely harmless. Don't believe all the nonsense you read on social media. It's just sodium bicarbonate. It's not harmful for your body. But the problem is that restaurants will sometimes overuse it. Right? They use it to save money, right? Because it saves down on cooking fuel. Right? So this is, and the other thing is that many things that have a lot of water, you can even be experimental and cook without water. So carrots, by the way, despite the fact that they look solid, are more than 88% water. Okay. So carrot has more water than milk. It's very counterintuitive, because milk feels like liquid. Okay. But milk has a lot of other dissolved things that are not water. Right? The carrot is just mostly water, but it's structured that way. Now, with just a little bit of butter, you can completely caramelize carrots in a pressure cooker. So the Maillard reaction will happen because now there is less water. And then the carrot will become brown, and then you can just mash it and make a carrot soup with nothing other than carrot, butter, and salt. You don't need to add anything else. No onion, no flavors required. It's called a caramelized carrot soup. It will be the greatest carrot soup you've ever had, and it's very little work. But be careful, because people tend to be nervous by using the pressure cooker without water, right? But you can use, but butter also has water. So another common misconception is that you have to really knead well to get a soft chapati. Actually, no, you just have to put water and let the dough sit, it will knead itself. So just letting the dough rest for 30 minutes will get you a soft chapati. You don't have to, of course, if you like working out your shoulder muscles and so on, I think it's fine, but otherwise you don't really need to do that. Simple principles, more water in a dough, softer product. Adding eggs and milk will also result in a softer dough. More fat to the dough will make it flakier. So that's why for parota, you have to add a lot of oil to the dough, because it cannot be chewy. It has to sort of slightly be more chewier, right? The extreme example is what you eat when you eat egg puff or veg puff. That is basically same wheat flour with so much butter or fat or palm oil added to it that it just literally falls apart in your mouth. It's not chewy at all, right? So fat breaks down gluten structures. So that's the simple sort of philosophy. Other common thing that you have to marinate meat for longer to get flavor. No, you don't. Marination only adds flavor to the surface of the meat. That's all it does. As I said, it doesn't go inside. If you apply ginger garlic on your hand will not become a tikka flavor. Okay? I think it's important to understand that you need to largely adds flavor only to the surface, right? So, but if you soak it in salt water, that will actually make the meat much softer. The reason for that is that when you go running in the morning and you get really exhausted and you have to drink some lime juice, it needs to have salt and water. Why is salt required when you get dehydrated? Because the salt, when it gets into your muscles, will prevent further dehydration. In plants, salt removes water. When you're cooking something and you add salt, it will squeeze out water. When it comes to meat, when you add salt, it helps retain water. So that's why soaking chicken in salt water will actually make it softer when you actually cook it. Now here's one of my favorite ones. When you go, how will you pick the tastiest vegetables in the grocery store? You know, let's say you've been asked to go buy vegetables. Will you pick I'm sure your mom or grandmother will say, pick the fresh looking, absolutely healthy looking, large looking, flawless looking vegetables. So it turns out that you should actually pick the ugliest, smallest, most flawed looking vegetables, because as I said, plants defend themselves against predators using chemistry, right? The more the plant defends itself, the tastier it is going to be, because all those defense chemicals are flavor, right? A smaller tomato, uglier tomato, is more likely to have fought off predators, will have a lot more flavor than a giant, healthy looking, tasteless tomato. If you've been in the US, you know those tomatoes have no flavor at all, because there's so much pesticides being used, no pests are attacking the plant doesn't have to defend itself, completely blank, right? So this is also why if organic farming is done properly, organic vegetables tend to taste a little bit better, because the plant is going to get attacked by more pests, right? So that's the whole point. Okay. So you should always pick the ones that actually look absolutely ugly. The other interesting thing is that if you're in Chennai, if you're dealing things with patani peas and carrots and all that, in most situations, particularly in summer, the frozen peas, frozen carrot, way more fresher than the fresh one. So because we now eat off season, most of these vegetables are harvested during season, etc., off peak, non-ripe, to survive all the transportation, warehousing. Then you think you're buying it fresh from your supermarket, right? Unless you grow your own carrots in your backyard, don't assume anything you buy is actually fresh. Frozen carrots, on the other hand, typically tend to be frozen few hours after they're harvested. So they can be harvested at peak nutrition. As long as you don't have power cuts and you have a freezer that works, frozen stuff in many situations is at least as nutritious, if not slightly more nutritious, in the context of certain vegetables, winter vegetables, and so on, because there is no biological activity at those temperatures and so on. And I want a couple of other broader things, but one is that food evolves all the time. So don't be obsessed with what is authentic something. Okay? What is authentic? Is there an Indian authentic potato dish? Potato itself came only 150 years ago, right? What does it mean to say that something is authentic? My biryani is more authentic than your biryani. I mean, all of this is essentially, the dish itself is a mix of spices from Southeast Asia, cooking techniques from Uzbekistan, with unique ideas from India, and that has evolved in every single place, and so on. So what is interesting is that essentially authenticity is you saying that my version is better than yours. You're not really saying anything. People don't realize, like Shah Jahan's biryani had dal. It had mutton, it had rice, and it had dal. Right? But today, if you go eat some biryani and if it had paripu, you will say, what nonsense is this? This is like khichdi. I will not eat this. It's not authentic. But the Mughal recipe literally says that there is dal. And for those wondering whether veg biryani is really biryani, Shah Jahan had paneer biryani. It was one of his paneer zafran biryani, saffron and paneer biryani or something that the Mughal emperor had. Okay? So it doesn't get any more authentic if you are worried about whether veg biryani is biryani or not. Right? And another classic example, okay? Pav bhaji, if you've had pav bhaji, okay? The word pav is Portuguese for bread. Indians did not have bread. The idea of fermenting wheat to make bread is very much a Portuguese introduction, first to Goa, which is why the Marathi and Konkani word for bread is pav. Right? Bhaji, look at the ingredients of bhaji. Potato from South America, tomatoes from Mexico, capsicum, Mexico, chilies, Mexico, carrots, all the other beans and every one of these things from England, Europe. So in fact, if you ask some people, they'll say English kaigari. All of these, why there is no Tamil word for beans and carrot is because they're not Indian vegetables, they're not South Indian vegetables. They are British vegetables that were introduced. We used to call them English kaigari. So pav bhaji, amazing Indian dish, has no Indian ingredients. Okay? And yet is uniquely Indian because it's the technique of cooking and all the other history behind it, right? The pav bhaji, the idea of saying that, well, what food can I make that is high carb that will be given to all of the mill workers in Bombay? with, in many cases, rotting vegetables. You cook it with so much butter that they cannot make out that the vegetables are actually rotten. That is how it began. Right? That's a uniquely Indian story. Right? And it is how we cook. We are able to take Indian food, essentially means you take ideas from everywhere, ingredients from everywhere, make it uniquely Indian. Right? So I think we shouldn't be bothered about things like authentic and all that. Right? And we think food unites us, but here's the interesting thing. If you grew up in a family where you did not eat fish, versus if you grew up in a family where you ate fish, right? There is one molecule called trimethylamine. If you walk by a fish market or by Marina Beach or by Besanagar Beach in the morning, trimethylamine is exactly what you're smelling. If you grew up in a fish eating family, it's the warm, nostalgic smell of your house kitchen. If you grew up in a vegetarian family, it's the nasty smell of a fish market. So the problem with entire thing is that food can, if you let it, it can divide us. Meaning that if you did not grow up eating fish, it will be very hard for you to eat food in the house of someone where fish is being cooked. Right? So it takes a lot of individual work to build that tolerance for what other people eat. What you eat, what you consider nasty is somebody else's food. Right? And again, here's the interesting thing. I discovered, for instance, that a lot of North Indians, when I first went for my TCS training in 1999 in Trivandrum, many of North Indians were coming to South India for the first time. College kids, only eaten home food, North Indian food. One, they've never seen the sea in their lives. First time they're seeing the sea. Okay? Many of them actually fainted because they've never seen this much water in a single place. Second thing is, all of them immediately had nauseating sensation when they smelled coconut oil. They could not eat food cooked in coconut oil. They could not tolerate the smell of jackfruit. Now, if you are South Indian, you're like, come on, that's absolutely delicious. But then, you take a South Indian, put him in Calcutta, they'll have the exact same feeling about mustard oil. My mother cannot stand the smell of mustard oil. It's way too pungent. Bengali homes will literally smell of mustard oil because the smell never leaves the walls. In Calcutta, you'll go, houses actually, the walls smell of mustard oil. Right? So it is such a pungent sort of thing. Right? So the problem is that you have to, the neurogastronomy of flavor works against uniting people. Religion and caste determine food habits, and food habits determine identity. Right? You're often defined by what you don't eat. Again, fun fact, the only part of the world where we use the term non-veg. No other part of the world. Nobody uses the term non-veg. How is it that you get to define the eating habits of the majority on the basis of what the minority does not eat? So I actually went to a wedding in Kerala where they had a new interesting trend. Right? So they had in the reception, they had a veg counter, they had a normal counter. They literally called it veg and normal. Okay. So that is it. So in a sense, it's actually weird. So sometimes, our identities often define that, right? And it's easier to build a six-pack than to eat something you're not used to, right? And so uniting with food requires a lot of individual hard work. You've got to somehow suspend your disbelief. The more you learn about what other people eat, what other people consider food. Icelandic people eat rotten raw shark, right? It's food. Inuits in Canada eat whales. They eat seals, right? And but in a sense here, sometimes we're not able to tolerate the smell of mustard oil and somebody using, something else and so on, right? So, last but not the least, I think, being scared of food is completely counterproductive. In fact, if you follow social media, chances are you're just being needlessly scared about food, because scaring people, generally the algorithms prefer to go viral, right? So, if you scare people, it's easier for it to go viral than if you reassure people. So there's a term called orthorexia, is this sort of crippling anxiety. Am I eating the right thing? Am I feeding my child the right thing? Oh my God, did I give some low quality honey? Or did I give a biscuit that has palm oil? Should I give air fried food? Can I microwave the milk that I give to my kid in the morning, or will it cause cancer? For the mathematicians out there, the single biggest reason why people are afraid of cancer is because they didn't study Bayes' theorem. Only the mathematicians are smiling, right? You should regularly see, eating this increases cancer risk by 300%. It will be a headline. The original risk was 0.01. It became 0.03. That's 300% increase. So people sometimes forget that when things are actually rare, you can completely twist numbers any which way you want. Right? And so the problem is that people believe that, like, people believe jaggery is not sugar, and diabetics are eating jaggery because they believe it's not sugar. People believe the organic is amazing, etc. They believe vegan diet or believe in keto diets. A1, A2 milk, which again is complete nonsense. So the difference between A1 and A2 milk is in one specific casein protein, one difference in one protein. Okay, amazing thing. People pay 2,000 rupees for A2 ghee. Ghee is 100% fat. There is no protein in ghee, and that is the only difference. And people actually pay like 4 times more for that, right? People are afraid of microwaves, air fryers, and fridge and freezer, and old food, and refined oils, and palm oil, non-stick, right? So it just turns out, again, it's very simple, right? So how balanced your plate is and how much you eat is way, way, way more important than whether you're eating one superfood, one super ingredient, one turmeric, amazing, it'll prevent Alzheimer's. Okay. Now just consider it, right? The tests for turmeric have all been done by taking the actual molecule curcumin and then like force feeding rats with that and so on. Okay? Because in general you can't, as you might imagine, you can't test these things on human beings. You test on rats. When you eat turmeric at home, you're taking the dehydrated powder, which, by the way, the act of dehydration and heating anyway will destroy a fair bit of the micronutrients. It's not like we eat the fresh turmeric root all the time. You only eat the powder. And in one entire sambar, you will put 1/4 teaspoon. How much curcumin is one individual getting? So what's the one thing people forget? Denominators. People just forget that sometimes that the actual amount you're actually getting is very, very a tiny fraction. People will buy Himalayan pink salt because it has minerals. 98% is sodium chloride. 2% is all the rest of that stuff. You put 1 teaspoon of salt. How much is 2% of that? How many minerals are you actually going to get? Right? So I think people just sometimes don't think about these things, right? And in a sense, I think when it comes to food, simple advice: pay attention to your grandmother, ignore your grandfather. Metaphor for generally don't pay attention to people giving advice on food who do not cook. Okay? Right? There is wisdom in the practical wisdom of passed on knowledge from grandmothers and mothers and so on, in terms of keeping people healthy. So there's some practical wisdom. There's some, you can still sort of, largely Masala Lab again is about validating a whole bunch of cooking techniques that our grandmothers have largely taught us, right? At some level, you can still, yes, put it through the scientific test, be skeptical, etc., etc. You're still more likely to find more sense in what your grandmother says about food than what these uncles say on WhatsApp, right? So please do not believe grandfathers on WhatsApp. So that's one thing. And last, and again, don't retroactively apply explanatory models from 2000 years ago to the present. I saw someone who said that potatoes are cold food, you must not heat in summer. They said, wait. Potatoes came to India in 1890s. Okay. How did Ayurveda people 2000 years ago know about potato? How could they have written about potato? Right? Just think common sense, right? I mean, for example, we did not even, there are people now making Ayurvedic arguments for endocrine disruptors, hormonal disruptors. Boss, we discovered the cell only in the 15th century. Only when we invented a microscope did we know that there were cells. Only then we understood the germ theory of what happens. We had then understood by 18th and 19th century, we understood the endocrine system, the circulatory system, etc., etc., to be able to then model why these problems occur. And then how can you say that, oh, according to this, this will upset the... So always be skeptical. Here's the interesting thing, right? Again, the original wisdom is often useful. But modern day practitioners are all fraud people. So they are now trying to sort of, use that to try and sort of get their own followers. And they're mostly all quacks, right? So respect the original. As I said, respect your grandmother. Don't respect these modern Instagram, influencers, or as I call them, influencers. So I want to end on a light note as a simple test of what all we have learned today. As a practical exam, if you will. Everything that we've learned about cooking in terms of thermodynamics, in terms of spices, in terms of Maillard reaction, in terms of the physics, in terms of the flavor aspects, we are going to now apply in our practical exam.
என்ன பண்றீங்க? ஒரு சம தண்ணி எடுத்துக்கங்க. அத தோசைக்கல்ல ஊத்தி அதுக்குன்னு வழக்கமா ஒரு விளக்கமா வச்சிருப்பீங்கல்ல ஆமாங்க அத அடிப்பக்கமா திருப்பி சரிங்க வரட்டுன்னு ஒரு 4 இழுப்பு இழுத்து சரிங்க நல்லா கழுவி விட்டுருங்க சரிங்க ஒரு
Okay, so step number 1, right? Why does the dosa maker use water and a broom to actually wash? So the immediate answer many people will give, no, it is to actually clean things, maybe stuck, etc. That's not actually the reason, right? Why doesn't he use a harder steel wool or something else to remove all of that? Because you have to remember that for an iron surface to be non-stick, it needs to be seasoned. Seasoned essentially means there's a thin layer of polymerized fat. As you keep using it and using it, the oils that you use will polymerize and create a non-stick layer. Otherwise, always remember rule number 1. Why does food stick to metals? Because the sulfur in proteins reacts with metals. That's all. Carbohydrates don't stick, fats don't stick, only proteins stick to metals. That is why eggs are the notoriously harder things to cook in anything other than a non-stick. Because eggs will stick because they're mostly protein, right? So here is why. So one, using a broom, make sure that you're not damaging that polymerized oil layer while still being able to. The second thing that water does is that, remember I told you iron is not an even distributor of heat. So liquid water is another way in which you distribute the temperature more evenly before you make the dosa. That's why even at home just putting a little splash of water is first and foremost to distribute the temperature a bit more. Otherwise one part will be dark brown and one part will be light brown. Sometimes that's why inexperienced cooks, when they make dosa at home, will be black in one part and completely white in another part, right? That's because they didn't do the temperature distribution. So that is the food scientist Vaigai Puyal explaining the thermodynamics of why we splash water.
இன்னும் நிறைய மாவு எடுத்து
Yes.
பெரிய ரவுண்டாவும் இல்லாம சின்ன ரவுண்டாவும் இல்லாம என்ன பண்றீங்க, ஒரு சம தண்ணி எடுத்துக்கங்க.
Sorry.
லக்கமா ஒரு விளக்கமா வச்சிருப்பீங்கல்ல ஆமாங்க அத அடி திருப்பி சரிங்க வரட்டுன்னு ஒரு 4 இழுப்பு இழுத்து சரிங்க நல்லா கழுவி விட்டுருங்க சரிங்க ஒரு கிண்ண நிறைய மாவு எடுத்து பெரிய ரவுண்டாவும் இல்லாம சின்ன ரவுண்டாவும் இல்லாம சரிங்க
Sorry.
சரிங்க வரட்டுன்னு ஒரு 4 நல்லா கழுவி விட்டுருங்க சரிங்க ஒரு கிண்ண நிறைய மாவு எடுத்து பெரிய ரவுண்டாவும் இல்லாம சின்ன ரவுண்டாவும் இல்லாம.
So this again is a very important point, right? So not a big round, not a small round. Essentially largely focuses on the optimal size of a dosa is different from the optimal size of an uttapam. Because your goals are very different. In a dosa you want uniform crispness on all surfaces. So you want the largest surface area you can get with the thinnest amount of marble, right? That's essentially the basic. You want to increase the surface area of exposure. Whereas in an uttapam it's a little bit more, you have to optimize and follow a little bit more, right? If it is too large, then you end up having, because you need a certain amount of thickness for all your toppings, you're going to end up with uncooked uttapam. And if it is too small, you're going to end up with ultra crispy uttapam that doesn't have any amount of softness at all. So that's why neither too big, neither too small. Again, classic food science, right?
பொதுவா ஒரு ரவுண்ட ஊத்தி 4-5 வெங்காயத்தை போட்டு அள்ளி படிப்படியா நறுக்கி அப்படியே மேலாப்ல பரபரன்னு தூவி விட்டு சரிங்க.
So this again is actually quite an interesting, right? Simple philosophy when you cut vegetables is always think surface area. More the surface area, the quicker it will crisp up. Less the surface area, the longer time it will take to crisp up because there's going to be less exposure. So again, simple math, right? If you take an onion and cut it into 4 pieces and total up the surface area versus when you cut it really small, each of them has like multiple surfaces. The surface area is much larger the smaller you cut something. Net surface area, right? So cutting onions really small essentially allows you the onion to crisp up and also undergo the Maillard reaction, right? So therefore that's what he's actually saying. Another important point he's actually making, he's not saying put the onion on the uttapam just simply. He's saying that you have to sprinkle it from a height. You know why that is the case? Again, simple physics. When you add salt, if you want to add it evenly, you don't want to do it from a low height, you want to do it from a higher height. The distribution is likely to be more even the higher the height is. Again, simple physics, right? So there are a lot of deep physics in his explanation. So anyway, so this is one.
என்ன பண்றீங்க, ஒரு ரவுண்ட ஊத்தி படிப்படியா நறுக்கி அப்படியே மேலாப்ல பரபர தூவி விட்டு சரிங்க ஒரு நீளமான கேரட் எடுத்து அதையும் படிப்படியா நறுக்கி சரிங்க அப்படியே மேலாப்ல பரபர தூவி விட்டு சரிங்க ஒரு 16 கரண்டி நெய் எடுத்து சரிங்க.
Yeah, so again, fats transport flavor. That's why 16 characteristics of gay, if you will. You might want to go a little bit less on it, and more importantly, the distribution. So you have to remember what roles fats play, right? One is the dissolving of the flavor spices. The second thing is that, like water, fats are again as liquids are able to evenly apply heat from the metal. So if the iron is at say 150 Celsius, there will be some parts of the iron that will be much lower, 130, some parts will be 180 and so on. Once there is a layer of fat, that fat, because of liquids, they tend to all transfer heat evenly because of convection. So therefore, adding that ghee allows actually uniform browning of the uttapam, right? So this is one.
அதுல 6 கரண்டி நெய்ய உள் சைடு அப்படியே லேசா விளாவி விட்டு சரிங்க 10 கரண்டி நெய்ய தோசைக்கு வெளி சைடு அப்படியே மேலாப்ல விளாவி விட்டு சரிங்க. இட்லி பொடி இருக்கு பாத்தீங்களா, அத அப்படியே அள்ளி மலை சாரல் மாதிரி அதை மேலாப்ல பரபர அப்படியே பேய விட்டு சரிங்க. பொத்துனாப்ல அப்படி ஒரு பரட்டு இப்படி ஒரு பரட்டு அப்படி பரட்டி விட்டு அப்படியே ரெட் கலர்ல முருக
Again, red color Maillard reaction. The more you get the Maillard reaction going, the crisper and browner. Actually, there's a small restaurant nearby called Madras Pongal, where they actually, one of the items on the menu is Annanakkoru Uttapam is literally an item on the menu. They are the only place in Chennai that follow this recipe literally. It's really tiny carrots, really tiny, and they use the smallest size vengayam, and it's like super crisp, tons of ghee. It is just absolutely perfect. You guys should try it out. Okay. So this is, in a sense, the lessons that I wanted you.
அழகா மடிச்சு கமகமன்னு ஒரு ஊத்தப்பத்தை எடுத்துட்டு வாங்க சரிங்க. அண்ணனுக்கு ஊத்தப்பம்.
So in your cooking life, don't be that guy. Pay attention. There is just so much science, and even if you don't like cooking, trust me, for people with kids, the reason they will learn more science in your kitchen than they will in school and college and engineering college and PhD. They will learn more science. They will understand more science, right? Because there's science in how you cut vegetables. There's biology in how you cut vegetables. When you cut a vegetable, you're damaging cells, right? So polyphenol oxidase enzyme comes out, it starts oxidizing. That's why your apples and everything goes brown when you cut them. So you have to soak them in water, so there's less exposure to oxygen and so on. So these are all these other sorts of things that you can think about. Squeezing lime juice also prevents it, because why? It's an antioxidant, right? So understanding these things, bringing it to life, right? As I said, learning to cook is not only the surest way to stay healthy for the longest amount of time, it is also the surest way to develop a love for science, and a practical science that you can look at it every day. You don't need a lab, right? You can look at thermodynamics at work. You can look at emulsions and foams at work. You can look at acid-base reactions at work. You can look at biology, biochemistry, you name it, right? So I think there's just so much joy that you can actually get out of it. And even if you personally don't, even if you don't particularly like cooking, right? Just go into the kitchen, observe others cooking, and while you're at it, maybe help them, right? So this is particularly for all the men here, right? So maybe this is an excuse for you to go help. In that way, you develop a deeper appreciation for the world of food, and the fact that, as I said in the first, that all food is one form of life, killing and eating another form of life, right? And human beings have taken that basic thing into this extraordinary level of complexity, grace, and sophistication, that we're able to make a butter chicken or a chettinad chicken curry or a paneer butter masala or a dosa or a idli or a vada or a madur vada. I mean, the spectacular diversity just within India of applying just the same few simple science techniques of turning raw ingredients into the most astonishingly delicious things is why you should love the science of food. On that note, thank you.
Hello. So thanks, Craig. Entertaining and very insightful presentation. Time for some questions, interactions, and so on. Yeah, shoot.
Hi. Thanks for the mouth-watering talk. And a few questions that in your travels, I guess you have gone and tried various cuisines.
Yes.
Do you think that there is some sort of correlation between the kind of preparation that goes into food and sort of the longevity of people? Like
Absolutely.
I'm asking about maybe some sort of, let's say, a comparison between Japanese cuisine and some others.
So the interesting thing is that the correlation is a lot less if you compare historical cuisines of people, right? So if people ate like their grandmothers did and had a similar level of physical activity, etc., no matter where in the world, that is largely it's largely the same. Where the biggest difference is seen is that the amount of ultra processed, imbalanced diets, people who basically are eating. So ultra processed essentially means that food without fiber for the most part, right? I mean, essentially, see, the problem is that vegetables, most of what you eat in a vegetable is not food for you, it's food for the bacteria in your gut, right? You can't digest cellulose, you can't digest many of those things, right? And that again is very increasingly correlated with long-term longevity. Prevention of a plant-based diet is very closely associated with that. I mean, a plant-based meaning that it does not mean no meat, it means per capita consumption of meat has gone up in places like the US, where I think the amount of protein in your diet is insanely high, is unnaturally high, right? And the amount of omega-6 in the fats that they eat, the amount of dietary fiber that they eat. So clearly, if you compare that diet with, say, a Mediterranean diet, for example, clearly the people in the Mediterranean region live longer. So it also, in a sense, it also has to do with, think about this, Indians in urban environments are changing their diet from their ancestral diets towards the more unhealthy stuff at a faster rate than Italians are, than the Greeks are, or the Japanese are. So the Japanese largely still eat like their grandparents did. Of course they eat processed food, but they still have a culture where they eat as a family. There's still a lot of vegetables, there's a lot of fermented stuff, there's a lot of seafood. So on an average, they still eat all of that. So still not as much, French fries and pizzas and so on, right? So in that sense, I think there is clearly a correlation between adoption of ultra-processed modern foods and sticking to traditional diets. Yes, absolutely. And the places where they are still sticking to their traditional ways of eating are generally being healthy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask another question?
Sure.
So again, with some sort of like preparations, it can get like gloriously complex.
Yes.
Very, very complicated procedures.
Yes.
Can you give an example of the most complicated one you have ever experienced?
Oh, okay. So that's, in general, I think the most complicated food comes from India only. So in general, there's an interesting, on a lighter note, there's a white paper, I think Paul Krugman, the Nobel economist, apparently wrote when he was in Yale or Cornell or something when he was young, I forget which university. He wrote a paper that correlated the quality and sophistication of a cuisine with the amount of equality in society. So the more unequal the society, the tastier the food. So meaning that you need to be able to oppress either women or poorer people to truly sustain a sophisticated cuisine. So, which is why England has the worst food, right? Because they were the first to industrialize. So factories came, women had to work in factories. So everyone had to work, so they switched to eating canned food, largely canned food and sausages and things that you can cook in under 5-10 minutes, right? So that's why British food is what it is. So that said, I think in general, some of the elaborate Bengali as well as the Lucknowi, Nawabi kind of dishes are some of the most insanely sophisticated, purely in terms of first and foremost getting all those ingredients. There'll be some rare flour you'll need to get and some random flowers essence that you will need to get and so on. So I think that's some of the most sophisticated food. In general, I think there's a professor called Ganesh Bagler at IIIT Delhi who specializes in computational gastronomy. He uses sort of data to analyze patterns in food and so on. And one of the things he's come up with something called complementary flavor. Right? So the idea is that Western food largely relies on using ingredients that share flavor molecules. So very simple. So butter and beef kind of go together. Mushroom and butter, mushroom and beef share certain flavor molecules, so they go together. Tomato and basil is another example, right? But in India, there is a preference for using ingredients that are very far away in terms of flavor distance, contrasting flavors, right? Southeast Asian as well as South Asian cooking, right? And within India, Maharashtrian and Bengali food has the most contrasting flavors in the same dish. So for example, there's a dish called shukto in Bengali that combines sweet, starchy, bitter, and a range of other textures and flavors in the same dish. So very few dishes actually highlight bitter, and it does, right? And it does it really well, right? So what you will find is that, and Maharashtrian food again has very hot, very sour, very this thing, crunchy, they'll add farsan on top. So the amount of textural variation also is much higher. Mughlai food on the other hand is a lot closer to the West in the sense that it has more creamier, more integrated flavors. So creamier, richer, seemingly, richer, etc., right? So within India itself, you span the diversity from Mughlai, which is sophisticated but one-dimensional flavor-wise, to a Maharashtrian or Bengali, which is like a party in the mouth. Right? When you eat chaat, it's like a party in the mouth. There's so many different flavors that hit you all at the same time. So that's the whole idea.
Thank you.
Next question.
I have two questions. One is very lighter, I will ask in the end, but one is, given the logic, the information that oils or fats are what carry the flavors in spices, but there are some dishes in which we put spices in water, right? Rasam and
yes.
So how does that work? And when I'm not putting tadka into rasam or sambar, am I doing it totally
It's not
wrong?
like that. No, so it is by design, right? So, like for example, the reason you throw in the ginger and other spices in when you're making masala chai is that you still want it to taste like tea. You don't want it to taste like biryani, right? So, by deliberately you want to lose most of the flavors to the air, and you want very little. So, when it says largely fat soluble means there will still be a few things that will still dissolve in water. So, you will still get a milder flavor. So, by design, when you want a milder flavor, you add the powder directly to the gravy. So, which is why actually if you want a stronger flavor also, that's why garam masala is added at the end. So, you don't lose the flavor. If you add the garam masala at the start to the gravy, you lose most of it to the air. Right? So that's why spice powders, if you want strong flavors, add towards the end. You want weaker flavors, add at the start. So that's the general idea. Right? The other interesting thing is that in case of many dishes that are sour, salty, umami, etc., the spices also work like perfumes, right? So there's a base note, there's a middle note and a top note, right? When you first cook, you're only experiencing the top notes because it assaults you right up front. When you store it for 24 hours and you eat it the next day, you're going to experience the middle and the flavor notes. That's why a fish curry and a biryani taste much better the next day, because you're going to experience all those flavors which you will never do when you eat fresh biryani. Right? So that's also the reason why some dishes like kodambas, vatta kodambu, certain things that are sour and spicy tend to taste way better the next day.
Are there more? Okay, I had one more serious question, which is like you said Italians and Greeks somehow are changing their habits at a faster rate, something like that. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? But on a lighter note, I mean, the message that green carries a bitter note, leaves a bitter note in mouth.
Yeah, very much, yes.
I know our board was green by design, but how about your shirt?
Sorry? But actually, it's interesting. I asked my wife for fashion advice and said, I have a pink, red kurta and green, and she said, okay, wear the green. So let me ask her why she picked the green. But so the interesting thing is that, like say, the green comes from chlorophyll, right? Okay. So, and essentially all colors in food come from very few things. So chlorophyll for green, anthocyanins for purple, etc., and carotenoids for red, yellow. Every shade of red and yellow, all the things in carrot and tomatoes, all that stuff comes from your carotenoids, anthocyanins, your beetroot, brinjal, all the rest of that is anthocyanins, and then anything green is chlorophyll. Right? These are only three things that yield color, and so on. And there's also something really ironic about chlorophyll as well, right? Which is that plants are green, because in the entire spectrum of light, it's the green part of light that plants find useless. Because they absorb the others as energy and they reflect back the green. So it's the one color plants are like, nah, this is useless. It's the color that we associate plants with. So there's always something very poetic about when you think about colors itself, is something is the color that is not getting absorbed, is getting reflected. Right? So on that note, yes. But on the whole Greek, Italian health thing, etc., right? It's too complicated. There's a range of cultural factors related to how people eat together, their eating habits, the sequence of dishes they serve. Like for example, in many Italian restaurants in Italy, the salad comes first. And now we know that if you eat fiber first, fiber is not digestible by you, right? And it forms a mesh in your small intestine. And then when you eat carbohydrates, pasta, the sugar rush into your blood is much slower. So it's actually good for long-term health and so on. That's why you should always, the first thing you eat in your meal has to be a salad. Then you eat whatever you want. First salad, then protein, then carbohydrates, then finally dessert, right? So in that sense, I think, it's quite interesting. The Mediterranean diet largely kind of sort of fits into that pattern as well. So the cultural reasons beyond just the individual, see, people eat whatever grows locally. That's just how agriculture and eating habits. And over time, each area has discovered, this tends to keep us healthy. This doesn't tend to keep us healthy as well. Yeah. Yes.
Any more questions?
Good evening, sir. So I just need to know one thing. We are adding fenugreek in fish curry, but not in chicken curry.
Sorry, you're adding?
Vendayam, sir. They will be adding vendayam in fish curry, but not in chicken curry. Whether there is any specific reason or just as a...
Vendayam, you mean onion, is it?
No, fenugreek.
Vendayam.
Fenugreek. Okay. No. See, again, it is fenugreek has a very specific flavor actually, right? Fenugreek has a very unique flavor. It has a molecule called sotalol that has a slightly caramelly flavor, but is also bitter. Okay. So, largely many of these choices are purely cultural, meaning that your grandmother did it and so I'm just going to continue doing it. There is no specific reason not to, but it's sometimes possible that using fenugreek in a dish that traditionally did not use fenugreek will introduce a new flavor that you may or may not be familiar with. So a lot of this has to do with familiarity, right? See, as I say, like for example, when people from Chennai go to Mumbai, if you go to Mumbai, you will find one very popular dish called Szechuan dosa. Okay, and locals absolutely love it, right? Actually, they like Szechuan dosa more than they like regular dosa. Okay? But South Indians are like, what nonsense? How can you spoil the dosa for me? I cannot tolerate this and so on. It's because you grew up eating dosa. Your flavor memories and nostalgia are about that non-Szechuan dosa. That person never did not grow up eating dosa. So for him, the novelty means that he is able to appreciate novelty in a dosa, but he won't be able to appreciate novelty in some Maharashtrian dish. So that is essentially how many of these things work. So as I said, I think in general, ignore all negative opinions about food. Everybody, when they say, I didn't like this restaurant, what they're really saying is that my taste buds and my memories didn't match with this. That's all they're saying. There is no general sense that it won't really. So if it works for you, it will work for you. That's really how it works. So you feel free to try it. Yes.
So, what is your views on fast foods are nowadays? Fast food.
Fast food, we did speak about it, right? So ultimately, it's not about the fastness of food, but it's about the nutritional content of that food. If it is high carb, low fiber, high fat. This is basically an high sodium. High sodium means high salt, right? These four things largely make most things something that's called hyper palatable, meaning that our evolution has meant that at no point in the past did we ever have a combination like this. If you're a hunter-gatherer, there is no low fiber, high protein, high fat, high salt kind of food at all. Nowhere you will find in nature, right? So therefore, our bodies are not evolved for it. So there's a sudden rush of calories you get, and over time, that's going to damage your health, right? So which is why I think in general, it's not about the fastness of food. I think in many cases, you can have a fast salad if you want, right? You can have chaat. Instead of all the fried items, there are places that will serve you salad chaat. Fruit chaat you can have. So there are ways in which you can have fast food that is still relatively healthy and so on, but pay attention to what it contains. High carb, high fat, high sodium, high sodium as well as fat and so on. That's really the problem, and low fiber. That's where the problem is. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
One more question. Okay. There's one question in the back. And then.
So my question is, so there's a famous thing, okay? It's generally a social media thing, okay? Your mother's food is safe, you live longer, it's better for your health. When it's cooked by a male in a hotel, it's not healthy.
Yeah.
Something like that. It's what's mean is women who cook generally it's healthier. Men who cook it's not healthier. That's
well.
Is it true?
Well, no, I mean, increasingly, of course, there are more chefs women chefs in restaurants now. The reason has more to do with sexism more than anything else. But in general, so think about a restaurant, right? A restaurant is a business, and a business has to compete with other places for your attention and your money. And it's a very tough business where if the restaurant does not get guests for a week, they have to shut down, right? It's a very tough business to be. And so therefore, the incentive in the free market is to try and make the most delicious food, right? And the same thing, the previous answer applies. The more fat you add to your food, the more delicious it will be. The more salt you add to your food, the more delicious it will be. Here's the interesting thing. If you add more fat, you can add more salt. Otherwise, if you don't add fat, then it will appear too salty. And by the way, you can add some sugar, then you can add even more salt, because that will balance out, etc., right? And so what this means is that, normally when people talk about counting calories, your one dosa in your home may be about 100 calories. The same dosa in a restaurant will be 300 calories, simply because it will have more fat. So you have to remember that in general, the restaurant's goal is not to serve you healthy food, it's to serve you delicious food. And generally, healthy and delicious are usually inversely proportional to each other. They don't go together, right? So that's the way it is. And so therefore, you have to be wary of the amount of fat. So by all means, eat at a restaurant, then maybe next few days, go easy at home and so on, right? You have to be, or within the same day, you adjust it, right? So it's not like that. There are some dishes that you can only eat at a restaurant. It's very hard to make at home and so on, right? But remember that it is at least 3 times more calories because of fat. And remember that 1 gram of carbohydrates is 4 calories. 1 gram of protein is 4 calories, but protein takes 30% of the calories are just used to digest protein, because protein is harder to digest. So protein calories you have to subtract 30%. Fats, 9 calories. So more than twice. So fats have as much energy in them as petrol and diesel does. They're literally like hydrocarbons, right? So therefore, you have to remember that according to cardiologists, an individual is supposed to eat 500 ml of oil, fat, in a month. You know how much that is? 1 tablespoon a day. Now go back and see how much you're probably eating. It's going to be definitely much more, right? So I think that's the problem. So in general, I think we forget that restaurant food is tasty because it has a lot of fat. And the moment they say low fat, it will taste terrible. You will never go to that restaurant. They won't survive at all. Anyway, yes.
Yeah.
Hello. The story on Pav Bhaji was very interesting, especially the mill workers and energy and stuff.
Yeah.
For the last 20, 30 years, we've been having very sedentary life. The number of people sitting in the desk and working. Are there any trends happening in food habits because of the
so
sedentary
here's,
lifestyle?
the broader problem around the world is that we are getting less and less physical activity per capita. We're getting more and more calories, because there's more and more hidden calories everywhere, right? You're snacking. Snacks are very easy to come by. You go to office. In fact, if you've been in the US, offices, people end up consuming so many things. All the snacks will be chocolates and candies and nuts, and I mean, there's just so much food all the time, right? And people are constantly sipping on like Coke and Pepsi, which again is like 9 tablespoons of sugar, in one sort of large serving of Coke. It is just insane, right? So I think it is fundamentally about the food environment has now become too calorie rich. Right? We see the problem is that human beings evolved in a very low calorie environment. We evolved in an environment where either you hunt an animal, you eat, and then you don't eat for a week, because you're not going to hunt every day. Or you dig up some root, or only summer you get fruits. That's it. No winter and all, no food, literally no food, right? And now we're eating 3 times a day. There's nothing in our evolution that says that you have to eat 3 times a day. So I think incorporating fasting, incorporating all of these things is generally a better idea, especially if you're not, and obviously getting more movement. For starters, standing up more, right? For example, standing up, you will burn twice as much energy as sitting down. Just standing. You don't even have to do walking, gym and all. Just standing up more by alone. So I think there's lots of changes that we need to make in our lifestyles, but more importantly, to our food environment. And so people think you can have willpower and not eat. No, you can't trust your willpower and all this. You have to change your food environment. If a snack is there in your house, you will eat it. If you keep it right by the bedside, you will eat it. So keep it in the highest shelf. So you have to add friction so that you have to make it harder for you to go get it, and so on. And then replace it with high fiber snacks. Things like, say, nuts are better than, say, chips, for example, right? And so you can still make those kinds of choices. But in general, we have to get a lot more activity and eat a lot less food. The problem is people want a quick win. I'll say, okay, you know what? I'm going to eliminate palm oil and magically I will become, no, not going to happen, right? You skip palm oil, what will happen? You will buy snacks that have groundnut oil. There is no difference. As far as your body is concerned, fat is fat. Okay. If anything, palm oil snack is cheaper because palm oil is cheaper. Groundnut oil, 3 times more expensive. By the way, to produce 1 kg of palm oil, if you want to produce 1 kg of groundnut oil, it takes 10 times more land and water. So the agricultural input to make the palm oil is incredibly productive. It's all very complicated. There are no easy choices. But yes, it means rainforest is being destroyed in Indonesia, Malaysia. All those problems are there. But palm oil is not going away. It is the cheapest source of fat in the world. But because it is cheap, Indians have a tendency to say, whatever poor people eat, it must be bad. That's not true. Okay. So just because, ration kadai gives palm oil, it must be bad. No, that's not true. It gives that because it is cheap. And all fats beyond a point are bad for you. Okay. So you focus on that rather than, which one. Right? Yeah.
There are 2 questions from YouTube. So one is maybe a quick question, which is, so there's some idea that you shouldn't eat fruits on an empty stomach. So is there some science to that, or is that one of those misconceptions?
So to be fair, many of the food combination, food rules, eat this, that time, hot food, cold food, summer food, winter food and all that, are all products of a time when there was no refrigeration, when the risk of food poisoning and food going bad is a very real thing. So if you cook something in Chennai, 2 hours it's going bad, given our climate, right? So it is obvious that our ancestors would have said, no, you have to eat it fresh, you have to eat it quickly, eat it before 4 hours, don't eat this on an empty stomach. You don't know. So many of those rules came at a time when the environment was very different. So I think the problem people often have is that they're not able to square that with the fact that we now live in a significantly more hygienic, we use refrigeration, we use better cooking techniques, we use better storage techniques, we use better farming techniques and so on. All of this means that you have to start to think, and also know the rest of the world. Like for example, people will say you cannot mix fish and dairy, right? That's, but then if you just go to North India, fish tikka requires yogurt and fish, right? Bengalis eat fish and dairy. Entire Mediterranean eats fish and dairy. And they live 20 years longer than Indians. And so part of it is also about when you know other people do it and it seems to be perfectly fine, you need to be able to let go of some of those things, right? So the problem is it's retroactively hard to figure out why some of these rules are put in place. But rest assured, they probably originated in good faith, meaning that, maybe for some reason you don't do this, right? A classic example, I think a nutritionist recently pointed out. They will say that in summer you should not eat eggs because eggs is sood, egg is hot. And in summer, if you eat, etc., you will get constipation, right? No, it turns out what ends up happening is that in summer, naturally people's diet tends to go low on fiber and people drink more water. And what ends up therefore happening is that your protein intake hasn't changed, but you're eating less fiber, you're going to get constipated. So it's almost as if the observation and the actions are right, but the theory is wrong. So you will find many things where the advice is good, but it's the why is often not why it works. It's something else, right? So in a sense, I think so. Therefore, if people want to eat eggs, people want to do any of these things, eat fruits on empty stomach, do anything they want, right? All of that stuff they can just simply try, and if it doesn't harm them, it doesn't harm them. That's it, right? And every individual is unique. Sometimes some people have acid reflux. Every individual reacts very uniquely. The problem with nutrition is that there is no universal advice. Right? Some people are lactose intolerant. How many people know that 70% of the South Indian population is lactose intolerant as adults? That's why we're all Tair Sadam people, not milk people. North Indians are the paneer, milk heavy people because they are 70% of they're genetically lactose tolerant. Right? So therefore I think, therefore people end up having more rules about milk in South India than in North India. Because their entire source of protein is dairy. Whereas here, protein source is largely seafood and animals rather than dairy, right? So that's the thing. Yes.
What?
Sorry. No. So lactose intolerance is essentially that. So all of us are born with the ability to produce an enzyme called lactase to digest lactose in milk. Okay. And the general mammalian evolution is that all animals, as soon as they are weaned from mother's milk, that enzyme production stops. That's how it happens which is also why you shouldn't be feeding your cats and dogs milk, but people still do. Most of them will be lactose intolerant, to be honest, but they still drink it. They get some nutrition, but they will have diarrhea and all of that, right? But the whole idea is that, but it's not like an on-off switch for humans. Because humans have a mutation where some populations that originated in Central Asia, then populated Northern Europe as well as North India around 5,000-6,000 years ago, had a mutation that allowed them to be lactose tolerant as adults, significantly lactose tolerant as adults, right? And then because of population intermixing over the time, so now there's a spectrum. Right? So it's not like as soon as people stop, mother's milk stops, they don't become lactose intolerant. But maybe once they're 20, 30 years old, they slowly start seeing symptoms where eating a full glass of milk makes them feel uncomfortable, bloating, and so on. Because at that point you can't digest. Your bacteria and your gut will be like, oh great, I'm going to eat all of this. Then they will generate all the carbon dioxide and gases which you will feel as bloating. Right? So that's really what's happening, right? So it's a spectrum. Okay. So, and it shows up differently for different people. Some people for whom very severe, for some people they're still able to manage, they largely ignore. When you eat yogurt, the whole idea of yogurt is that the bacteria eat all the lactose and convert it to lactic acid. So you don't have to deal with but there is still some lactose, they don't eat all of it, right? So because milk where all the lactose has been eaten will be super sour, right? So there is still some lactose. So paneer again is, will be filled with lactose actually. So, yeah.
Maybe just, one last question from YouTube at least. So there's a question about food styles. I think this is related to one of the earlier questions. Food styles and emotions of people around the world. So, different foods, you talked about how they evoke different emotions. So do you have some ideas about how foods from different parts of the world?
So I think rather than foods evoking emotions, that's probably cultural, but biochemically speaking, emotions tend to affect the way you perceive food more than the other way around actually, right? So if you're in a good mood, if you're depressed, etc., if you're happy, those affect specific ways in which flavors are perceived. Like for example, also in very unhealthy ways as well. So people who are depressed and unhappy will often eat more. They will eat more high calorie unhealthy foods. People who are stressed, for example, your brain will say, okay, we'll make some simple machine learning prediction and say, okay, this guy's going to be using a lot of cognitive capacity, pretty stressed. So I'm going to impel him to eat super high carb, high fat calorie food because I need to make sure I get enough glucose for all the effect. So people under high stress are more likely to make unhealthy food choices, right? So that is why often, they say that, when you're in a very stressful work environment, make sure you don't have snacks around because you will eat them and you will not even know that you're eating them, right? So it is just that emotions affect this rather than the other way around. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, last.
Mayonnaise. But I'll tell you the most, this might, okay, I'm going to give you a slightly, No, so emulsification, there is no chemical this thing there, right? It's a physical process, right? There is no chemical thing happening there, right? Ultimately, you're making a fat-water mixture, essentially, right? So what is happening is that you need an emulsifying agent that is able to kind of have a water-attracting part and a fat-attracting part so that you're able to keep that texture, right? And the stronger the emulsifying agent, the longer the emulsion will last. So normally in a mayonnaise, you might use something like a mustard. Mustard is an emulsifying. There's a molecule in mustard that is an emulsifying agent and so on, right? Lecithin, eggs by itself is an emulsifying agent in that sense, right? So what happens is ultimately that when you agitate it physically, you're going to end up creating these bonds so that you have the fat water is stabilized in some sense. Okay. The other interesting fact that I wanted to give you is that most people don't realize that we eat fats. Okay. The first thing most people don't realize is that food most people think is about chemical changes. It's not. Mostly it's state changes until 110 Celsius. Maillard reaction is when chemical changes actually happen. That is when there's actually bonds are changing, new molecules are being formed. Till then, nothing is actually happening. Amylose molecules are, all three-dimensional structure changes, crystalline structure changes, all these other changes are happening. There's no chemical change per se happening in food, right? Now, the other thing you would realize is that we are mostly water. We are mostly water, etc. And we know oil doesn't mix with water. Fats, by the way, don't undergo any changes at all in the cooking process. They go straight in. Okay? And ultimately, they get digested only in your intestine. Okay? Fat doesn't mix with water. How does your body deal with fat all the way down? Because it doesn't mix with water, right? Or anything, enzyme, everything in your digestive system is water based. So this is where bile comes in. So your liver produces something called bile, which I know not to be disgusting, but you know, since I've made everything appetizing, when you vomit, that nasty, that smell you get is bile. Okay? So bile is an emulsifying agent. So your liver produces bile, and all the fats you eat are turned into mayonnaise. So when you eat oil, it turns into mayonnaise once it kind of gets into your stomach, and then from there it's all mayonnaise. Till your intestine then has these lipases to break down everything and then take out all the fatty acids. So mayonnaise, next time you look at a bottle of mayonnaise, you know there's mayonnaise also flowing through your digestive system every time you eat fat. So the more fat you eat, there's more mayonnaise you have in your body. Yeah. So.
Okay, I think we should wind up now.
On that unappetizing note, yes.
So thanks, Krish, for this very entertaining and very insightful talk. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to our media team for doing the recording, streaming, etc. Thanks to Tamil Nadu Science Forum for agreeing to co-host this event. And there's some snacks outside. Hopefully it's healthy.
Snacks are not meant to be healthy.
Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. So.